That's also a very good place to start. Then the temperate fruits are the things that have a winter dormancy. They're deciduous, they lose their leaves. So these are things that, we would consider the common fruits of apples and peaches, plums, pears, things that fall in that category, and they need some winter chill. Then in the semi-tropicals, we have citrus. We call them citrus trees, but by nature, they're really a large shrub. And then the hardy avocados. There are three families of avocados. Pretty much named for the region of the world where they come from. So there's West Indies, Guatemalan, and Mexican. And the Mexican varieties of avocados are the ones that are hardy for us without extensive protection. Then of the Mediterranean fruits, we have olives and pomegranates that we can grow. We'll talk a little bit about characteristics they need. In other words, they're going to need a higher and drier soil environment than most. And then I can't really name all of the tropical, rare, and exotic fruits that can be grown here, but the ones that we would consider in the tropical fruit area that are more common to us would be bananas, papayas, mangoes, guavas, starfruit, dragon fruit, lychee, and grumachama. But like I say, there's a huge, huge palette of tropical fruits that we can grow. Where to buy fruit trees? Normally, I would love to be telling you that I would like to see you at the upcoming Urban Harvest sale. I really am missing the sale this year. It's exciting to organize it. It's exciting to manage it, and it's exciting to see all of the families out picking trees on sale day. So I think all of us are feeling a little bit of longing for the fact that just out of an abundance of safety for both our volunteers and the public, we're not going to have it this year. But there are master gardeners in the surrounding counties that are holding virtual fruit tree sales. So Fort Bend County, Brazoria County, of course, Harris County, Montgomery County. Each one of these, if you'll just look up the extension office, they will have information about their sale, and you'll have access to a virtual catalog, and then they will give you information there on what they would call their pickup day, the day that you would actually go to pick the trees up. And we do, they support a lot of education, so we do recommend that you support them as often as you can. Very fortunately for us, our local independently owned nurseries and feed stores also stock fruit trees. Most of them now stock fruit trees all year long because most of the fruit trees we grow now are container grown. So they're able to stock them all year long. And I would also say that you can go with reputable internet vendors. What do I consider reputable? If it's you really need to be careful about information that they're giving you. If they need to have the chill hour information, especially on the temperate fruits, it's very helpful if they have the pollinizer information, whether or not the tree that you're selecting requires a pollinizer. And if it does require a pollinizer, what the recommended pollinizers are. So there are lots and lots and lots of internet vendors. First of all, no one out of the state of Texas can ship citrus to you. So citrus must be grown, must be purchased locally. And I will say that the overwhelming majority of citrus available in our area comes from two wholesale growers, both of whom are leaders in disease prevention programs monitored by the Texas Department of Agriculture. So it's all about the safety and security of the citrus industry. And we're trying to manage some diseases that are affecting citrus. So we want to make sure that everyone follows all of the Texas Department of Agricultural rules when it comes to purchasing citrus. So the keys to success with fruit. This is kind of where our program is focused today. The selection of appropriate varieties is very on the top of the list for a reason. Site selection and sunlight exposure, as well as the drainage and soil preparation, are all definitely very important in having long-term success with fruit trees. And then proper planting, you can make a few mistakes there, and trees are a little forgiving, but the better you plant them, the stronger the tree will be, the faster it's going to come into production, and it's going to have a better health and longevity as well. And then early training for the tree is important, just like raising children. We train our trees in that first 3 years, and then they're off to a good start after that. We're going to cover organic nutrition and timely care and maintenance. So this group of things are the palette of skills that we need to draw from to have successful fruit in our landscapes. When it comes to the right varieties, the first thing we need to remember is that not all fruits are suited to be grown on the upper Gulf Coast. So of the ones that we personally have trialed, that members have grown for a long period of time, most of those are listed on the Urban Harvest website in the gardening advice section, and then going to the fruits tabs specifically. The information that's there is arranged in PDFs, so it should be easy for you to print them. You can print out what we would consider a handout for the varieties that you wish to grow in your backyard, or the varieties that you're already growing in the backyard, so that you can use that information to refer back to as you go through the fruit tree year. Bob Randall and I, over the last, I guess, 5 or 6 years, have rewritten all of those and standardized them with some fruit tree care recommendations in them. So they should be in really good shape. And the varieties that we recommend are listed at the bottom of each one of those handouts. And then in a normal year, we would say we would invite you to attend pre-sale classes. This year, with our Fruit Tree Festival being basically an online experience, there's also a lot of classes and different things that you can enjoy there that will make your fruit tree experience better this year. And then hopefully going forward, we can have a more personal exchange when it comes to growing fruit trees. So what makes a variety the right fruit tree for our area? Number one, it's suitability to our climate. And where a lot of parts of the country worry about the severity of winter, here we have to get them through the heat and humidity of summer. And also they have to be able to cope with our mild winters. Mild winters are great for tropical fruits, and they're great for things like citrus. They're not so great for things like the temperate fruit trees. So we have to be able to find a balance there. They need to be adaptable to our soils. And this is going to come to a large extent from the rootstock. And as a consumer, you don't have as much choice about the rootstock that things are grafted to. But thankfully, the citrus growers in our area produce fruit for us on citrus rootstock that's well adapted to our soils. And the dwarf trees are grafted to a rootstock that's a little slower growing, which holds their size back and also their growth rate back a bit. And then our temperate fruit trees are generally grafted also to a selection that is more adaptable to our soils. If you're going with the temperate fruits and berries, you need to have a proper chill rating, and that chill rating has to be matched to your specific location. Houston is a very large county, and our chill hours vary widely across the county. And I will talk about chill for quite a while today. And then when it comes to the semi-tropicals and even true tropicals, there we need to worry about hardiness, which is the opposite of what we are concerned about with our temperate fruits. So we need to match it to the hardiness of our backyard climate without protection. We also can include some things that we push the hardiness on by providing some sort of winter protection for them. And in a lot of times, it has to do with disease resistance. We avoid varieties that are prone to diseases that are prevalent in our area, and rootstock can have an effect here too. For example, most of our prunus, the peaches and plums and things, are grafted onto a rootstock that's known for its resistance to nematodes, which are something that affect those varieties. So all of these things just make it suitable to both our climate and to our soils. So let's talk about the chill hours that I've mentioned a couple of times here. Some fruits, fairly muchly all of the temperate fruits, require a minimum number of chill hours or chill units. You'll see it referred to often in articles or in .edu texts about it. It'll be labeled as CU. They mean chill units. Those words are interchangeable. Chill hours and chill units are interchangeable. And it requires this minimum number of chill hours in order to break dormancy, bloom, and produce fruit the following year. So almost all of the temperate fruits and the majority of the berries have a chill hours rating. Chill hours does not apply to semi-tropicals and tropicals. So it's not going to apply to citrus or any of the truly tropical fruits. Chill units are based on high and low temperatures during winter dormancy. And there are several different models that are used to calculate chill, but the most common one is the accumulation of hours between 32 and 45 degrees. So it's not always about having killer cold or having heavy freezes or how many frost days we have, because the hours below freezing, below 32 degrees, don't count towards the total. They don't have a negative impact, but they're not included in the accumulation of that particular model. And hours above 60 are deducted. So in those time periods that we have very warm days for stretches at a time, we're not really accumulating any chill hours. Now, I will say that this map, which is very commonly available here, this is really too generic for us. For example, in this zone right here, this pink zone that follows along the coast is listed as 400 chill hours average. And yet here in the Houston area, down towards Galveston Island, we might have 150 to 200 hours, whereas upwards north of Tomball, we might accumulate as many as 550. So that's really just a little bit too generic for us. So we need to get down to something that's a little bit more specific. Here are some local averages along the Gulf and Bay areas, as I mentioned, in the Galveston, League City, that type of area would be 300 or less. Hobby areas about the same amount. The inner city, because of the heat sink, also has fewer accumulated chill hours. Fort Bend County can have as much as 400 to 600, and then counties north of Harris start building chill hours fairly rapidly as you progress northward. Now, I will say that there are some places that you can learn a little bit more about chill hours. Dr. Randall approaches it from the aspect of the actual by neighborhood on his website, which is yearroundgardening.me. So you can find a lot of information there about fruit trees and how the winter weather affects them. And then my own educational website, thegardenacademy.com, I have a chill hours article there. And in that article, I have a link to a national chill hours calculator called getchill.net. And when you go to getchill.net, they give you a link to a map of the United States. You'll click on your state, you'll find your closest local weather station and write those numbers down. It has a call sign. Then you'll go back to getchill.net, enter in those call sign letters, and then click calculate, and it will tell you the accumulated number of hours of chill that you've had so far this year. And it'll surprise you sometimes. Now, they calculate chill, they accumulate it from November 1st to February 28th or 29th in leap years. And it'll surprise you that you don't think we've had a lot of cool weather, but remember that it's between 32 and 45. So those weeks in which we have kind of those gray, cool days that never break much over the 40s, we do accumulate a lot of chill during those periods of time. So it may surprise you. And if you feel like you can't find, most of these weather stations are in airports, both public and private airports. So you may find, like, for instance, where I'm located, I'm almost dead between Hobby Airport or Ellington Field and Intercontinental. So I've taken both of those and put them in, and then I run an average of the two, and that's going to be close enough. You can be within plus or minus 50 to 100 hours of chill and still know what your specific area can offer you. And the temperate fruits that are affected by a chill hours requirement, we show what the chill hour requirement is in the individual variety descriptions on the Urban Harvest fruit tree tip sheets on the Urban Harvest website. When it comes to hardiness, the other side of this, many of the semi-tropical fruits are hardy in our average winter temperatures and would require protection only when we get something out of the norm. For instance, in 2000, I think 11, when we had a week of temperatures that never got over freezing. And we do have those occasional times in which we dip below our average winter time. And then some semi-tropicals are marginally hardy and they might require protection in some winters and not others. So being a fruit tree gardener makes you a weather watcher. Before we launch too much into this, I want to address the idea that when it comes to choosing varieties, please choose your varieties for the fruit quality first. Some of the really best flavored varieties, especially in berries, may have thorns or seeds. And I know that people like to have thornless berries and they want to have seedless citrus, but in all honesty, you can remove seeds and you can avoid thorns, but you really cannot inject flavor or a pleasing texture into the fruit. So when it comes to thorns, your pruning and training mechanism that you use can minimize the exposure to thorns. For instance, the way I train my berry plants, I'm never inside a bramble. I never have to worry about having my arms scratched up from harvesting berries. So we can manage that part of it, but we really cannot deal with bland fruits. There's not something you can do to make that magically happen. And thorniness is one of nature's ways of protecting the fruit from browsing animals, from birds even. And so remember that thorns do have a purpose in nature. And in some cases, they can be used to provide property security. For instance, the American Waterworks Association did quite a study about using thorny varieties of citrus, especially the rootstock varieties like Flying Dragon, to plant for property security around public waterworks. So it can be an advantage in some cases. Let's talk a little bit about site selection. Um, we have, most of us are going to grow our fruit trees in the typical urban, suburban environment. And so we have to deal with um, mature shade trees that we want growing on our property and structures that are on our property. And we all don't always have the optimum orientation for sun exposure on the property. So the distance from structures is important. One of the good things about fruit trees is that they don't have those invasive damaging roots that the large shade trees do. Now, of course, we won't want to include pecans in this category, and they are, even though we grow them most commonly as a shade tree, they are technically a producing tree for us. That would be one tree, things like pecans and walnuts, chestnuts that do have a root system that you should protect. You know, you don't want it growing right next to your slab. But for the most part, fruit trees don't have that. For example, citrus never produce large invasive roots. They have basically a matted root system. But even your things like peaches and pears and plums, they're not going to grow under your slab and suck all the water out of it underneath and cause damage. So you have a lot of opportunities to find locations around your landscape without worrying about your structures. So for most of us, it's the distance from the structures and your walkways is going to depend on the training and anticipated mature size, meaning that you could actually grow something right up against side of your house or side of your garage if you were choosing to train it as an espalier, where if you were wanting it to grow more low and wide, you might not choose an area right next to a structure. So a lot of that is going to depend on what is your anticipated shape and goal of that tree once it's reached its full size. Then we also have to consider the distance from other trees. And rather than following a strict orchard plan of everything having to be on 15 or 20-foot centers, we want to make sure here that we're allowing enough sunlight and airflow to keep the trees growing and productive and healthy. So the distance from other trees is going to be more, what can you get out of that exposure? For example, you could plant something closer to a tree on the south side of the tree or the west side of the tree than you would on the north side or the east side of a tree, where your sunlight was more restricted and not as prevalent throughout the day. When it comes to sunlight, that is a very, very important aspect in siting your fruit trees. The American Horticultural Society has what they call a shade dictionary, and they define full sun as 6 to 8 hours of sun exposure minimum. With fruit trees, we'd like to have them get more than that. And for most of us, the entire edible garden needs more than that. And the reason for that is that sunlight exposure is going to affect the quality of the fruit, because sunlight is part of the photosynthesis process. And photosynthesis is how carbohydrates are formed in the fruit. And carbohydrates are the sugars that make fruit taste good to us. So sunlight is the engine that's going to drive how good the fruit tastes. Sun intensity is also important in this, in that most fruits are going to perform quite adequately where the sun falls directly on them from overhead at noon. And some fruits prefer morning sun, and morning sun is very, very good quality sun. It's not as harsh. It's very beneficial for lots of plants. Then afternoon semi-sun to semi-shade may be beneficial. Lemons and limes, for example, they love to have a situation where they can have morning sun and then are provided a little bit of protection with either semi-sun or semi-shade exposure in the afternoon. And raspberries, the raspberries that do well for us thoroughly enjoy morning sun and actually require having some protection in the afternoon in order for them to be healthy for us for a long period of time. Some fruits require protection from harsh southwest sun in the afternoon, especially when they're young. Avocados fall into this category. Young avocados sunburn easily, and sunburn takes more avocados down than just about anything else in our area. So until they are fully grown and have a very thick canopy and can protect their own trunk from the harsh southwest afternoon sun, they need some protection. So if you could locate them on the east side of a tree or someplace where a mature tree gives them a little bit of protection at that age, they'll be better off. Drainage. Okay, we are at the Houston Gulf Coast, so we have soils that don't drain quickly, and we have that drought deluge cycle that we have to find a way to manage. Fruit trees don't like wet feet, regardless. It doesn't matter. Even mayhaws, they like, everybody said, well, mayhaws grew along the riverbanks, and they do, but they were seasonally flooded and then not flooded the rest of the year. But the rest of your fruit trees for sure are not going to do well with wet feet. So you need to select a site that has excellent drainage. And there are two kinds of drainage that we have to deal with when it comes to our fruit trees. The first one is external drainage. This is the drainage that you see after a rainfall event. So after a heavy rainfall, this picture that we see here is kind of the classic Houston area where we have pockets of standing water here and there in the landscape. So your external drainage occurs when there's no standing water apparent soon after rainfall ends. So an hour or so of this would be fine, but 2 or 3 days of this would be very damaging to the tree. Internal drainage is a completely different situation. And sometimes we assume we have good drainage because we have good external drainage. We don't see standing water within a couple of hours after rain. But we can have a situation like you see in this slide where these two trees were planted at the same time by the same people and came from the same source. And yet this tree began to decline very, very quickly. And with a little bit of investigative work, it was found that the drainage under this tree was basically non-existent. So internal drainage is how quickly the water filters through the soil and into the water table below the soil. And you may think that you have adequate drainage, and yet you'll have a situation where internal drainage is not healthy for your fruit trees. This is what happens. This is the result of poor internal drainage. It reduces aeration, and the roots of your trees, roots of your fruit trees, desperately need a lot of air. All plants need oxygen to the roots. And as soon as they're in a situation where they're undrained, it kills off feeder roots. We see this happen very, very quickly in the vegetable garden. If a vegetable garden is inundated with water, the plants in that vegetable garden will begin to die off within hours of their roots being inundated. They're basically drowning. So you'll see the little vegetables actually start to wilt or close down where it looks like they need water, but that's not the case. They're basically just shutting down. And so we get in a situation with fruit trees where they'll tolerate it longer than your vegetables will, but they won't tolerate it over a long period of time. So we really want to have that very excellent internal drainage that will drain away and allow them to create a healthy root system that has adequate aeration. We can determine this by assessing the drainage before we plant. And this is very, very important for Houston fruit gardeners. The easiest way is to do your own drainage test. It doesn't require hiring a professional to do this. You'll need to dig a hole that's basically a cubic foot, 12 inches square and deep, and then turn your hose on full blast and fill that hole just as quickly as you can, and then remove the water and allow it to drain completely the first time. The purpose of this particular filling and draining is to saturate the soil around the hole that you've dug. Then after it's completely drained, turn on the water full blast again, because we want to fill this quickly, and fill that with water, and then remove the water source again. Then from that point, you need to time how long does it take for the water to drain completely out of that hole, meaning that there's no shiny soil and no sign of wet water in it. How long does it take? And you'll see different lists of time for adequate drainage on the internet, but they're not adjusting for soil type. And the adequate drainage time for clay soils is not the same as the acceptable drainage time for sandy or sandy loam soils. So we do need to get down to something pretty specific for us. And the times that you see here on this slide are for our particular clay soils. So if it drains if it takes longer than 12 hours to drain, that is considered poor drainage for that area, and you don't need to locate a fruit tree there, or you need to build a raised bed for the fruit tree. If it drains in 8 to 10 hours, that's acceptable. If you don't have another location, a fruit tree could be planted there. Again, probably better to plant in a raised bed or in a mound. If it drains in 6 hours or less, then it's a safe drainage area for a fruit tree to be planted. If you have that excellent to acceptable drainage, you can feel safe planting directly in the clay soil. And I know that that seems odd to a lot of people, but believe it or not, the clay soils in our area are very ancient soils. They're mineral rich and have a lot of nutrition in them. The trick to them is understanding how to manage them and how to keep them in balance so that the trees can benefit from that nutrition. And we'll address that when we get to the fertility section. If you have that marginal drainage, as I mentioned already, a slightly raised bed or mound planting will be adequate. If you have poor drainage, you need to either, if you don't have any other place that you can plant the tree, you need to provide a deeply raised bed for this. And deeply raised, I would say, is at least in that 12 to 18 inches range. It needs to be high and dry. Your other choices are that you can grow fruit trees in containers. You can grow a huge variety of fruit trees in large containers. Or if you really feel that you have bad drainage and you cannot find a place that you're satisfied is safe for the fruit trees, you can consult a professional to see about having French drains or swales or some sort of contouring added to your landscape that will improve your drainage. They can actually be part of the landscape that is attractive as well. So the slide that you see on your left, what they've done in this situation is they have actually used the pathway as that's the drainage pathway also. So you see that the beds are raised on both sides and fruit trees are planted in those raised beds. With heavy rainfall, all of the water from those drains into the pathway and is carried out of the garden and off of the property. In the slide that you see on the right, this is also a professionally installed swale system where the swale has been designed to quickly take drainage off of the property after a heavy rainfall event. This is also known as a dry stream bed, and it can be landscaped very attractively. They generally are very friendly to wildlife, so that's another advantage to having this particular type of drainage installed. Slightly raised beds mean a bed that's about 6 to 8 inches above grade. They don't have to be bordered, although a border will help you with retaining the soil around them. And if possible, it's nice to install these beds and allow them to rest 6 to 12 weeks before you plant the tree. That allows it to kind of become its own native soil area before it's planted. You won't have as many issues with soil settling and changing the elevation of your tree or exposing any of the roots. It really just kind of lets everything get settled in place, get soil biology started. It really works out very well. The bed mix that you want for any raised bed, regardless of whether or not it's a very deeply raised bed or whether or not it's just a shallow mound, you want to use a bed mix that is not peat based, that is compost based. And the most commonly available in our area is what they call a vegetable garden mix. All of our reputable soil yards carry a vegetable garden mix. It's basically equal parts of topsoil, sand, and compost. Most of them will tell you that their topsoil is composted topsoil, which just means that it's been managed in a way that it's the weed seeds won't be germinating and giving you trouble in your landscape. The sand is not sand like you find at, it's not play sand or fine sand that you find at the hardware store. This is basically a large aggregate sand. If you look at it with a magnifying glass, it kind of looks like small pea gravel. This is a little heavy for my liking. I've used it in the past, but I have found that I like to add additional compost to it. I add about a third extra compost for my vegetable garden and less than that for fruit trees. You really do want to make sure that it's not too heavy in organics. We want the organics there, but too much of that decomposing material. And as it decomposes, which is its job, you'll end up with either having to add soil, or you can actually have the tree start sinking down. So we do want to make sure we have adequate amounts of topsoil and sand, the minerals that don't break down. Another choice that you can use is rose soil. Rose soil is kind of a Houston invention, believe it or not, even though we see it nationwide now. And rose soil, again, has some of the aggregates in it, also is very compost rich, also has some ground pine bark in it, which is nice from a pH standpoint. It's very, very friendly to fruit trees from the standpoint of the pH range that they prefer. So what is an ideal soil for most roots? Well, what you see on this slide is what the average native soils were before we got here and started agriculture. So the native soils were about 5 to 10% organic matter to start out with. You can build yours up to about 30% over time using top-down soil improvement, which is basically what this program is designed around, is the idea that we're not going to alter the soil in the hole. We're going to work on top-down soil improvement. We like to have lots of pore space. And remember, pore spaces is where that aeration is going to come from. That's also where water goes when we irrigate or have rainfall. And that's where all the beneficial microorganisms live that are going to keep healthy soil. The texture that we're really looking for is sandy to sandy loam, which we don't have and we have to work on. From a pH standpoint, about 6.0 to 6.5, or just slightly acid, is good for the average of most fruits. There are a few fruits, things like blueberries, that prefer a more acid soil, which we can manage if we start from a good base. Citrus will tolerate between 6.0 and 8.0. Great many of our soils in the area are at about that 8.0, and most of our water, especially if you're on your well you'll find is usually in that 8.0 range. We have a lot of bicarbonates in our water in the area. So sometimes we can really work to acidify soil, and then watering from the tap, we undo all of it, but that's what we have to deal with. So how do you improve your soil, and should you improve your soil? And I will tell you that this is probably one of the most commonly asked questions, and it's also the biggest mistake that new fruit growers make, is that they over amend their soil for planting. We want to amend soil, but not during the planting phase. So most fruit trees will perform better over time if they are planted in minimally disturbed native soil. So we don't want to dig a hole, put the tree in the hole, and then add things like a bagged soil mix to that hole to fill in. We don't want to dig the hole and mix lots and lots of amendments into the soil that we're going to fill with either. And I know that people who are frustrated with clay soils are a little bit skeptical about this, but I promise after decades of research that most of us know now that minimally disturbed soil is going to be better off for your fruit trees over the long run. So highly improved soils cause major issues. The roots don't want to penetrate into the native soil. They'll stay in that highly improved soil for an extended period of time. They can even end up, if their clay is very compacted around them, they can end up circulating in that hole and end up choking the tree out. In addition, if you overly amend the soil with organic matter, the tree will sink as that organic matter decomposes. So if you're determined that you need to improve your native soil, if you want to till a lot of amendments in, don't do it right before you plant the tree, and for sure don't do it at planting time. You would need to start 6 to 12 months ahead. Don't improve just the planting hole, improve a very large area around the tree where the roots will eventually go as the tree reaches its maturity. Do that very well ahead of time and allow that soil to rest and become its own native soil area again before you plant. You can improve the native soil with compost. We call compost the great equalizer for a reason. It will improve both clay and sandy soils. If you want to add an aggregate, sand, as I mentioned already, the classic bagged sand from the hardware store is not the answer. It's too fine for this, and it can actually cause some issues. Expanded shale is a much better choice, or large particle sharp sand. As I mentioned, that's sort of like small pea gravel. But expanded shale is readily available. It's a permanent amendment. It does assist with moisture management, which is a really big deal in the Houston soils, and it's very excellent for providing additional aeration. We would also want to address adding rock minerals at that time to remineralize the soil. I think most of us are aware of the fact that our soils have been depleted of minerals, even in an urban area, and a great much of this area was in agriculture before subdivisions were built. So we do need to remineralize in all of the garden before we plant, for trees, for vegetables, really pretty much for everything. Green sand, you'll see it listed as Texas green sand. It is a Texas product. That is a very mineral rich soil. It will loosen clay soils somewhat and provide potassium and trace minerals. It's gypsum is not the answer here. Gypsum can be used for other soil building reasons, but not to loosen clay soil. Mycorrhizal fungi is also beneficial. Usually when you add good quality compost, that's all you need to do. Mycorrhizal fungi will be resident in that compost, and they will begin to populate the soil in your garden on their own from that compost. You can also buy dormant mycorrhizal fungi, and a lot of our locally produced fertilizers have mycorrhizal fungi in them as well. So Microlife and Arborgate Food Complete both have a mycorrhizal package in them. So now we've talked about soil, let's talk about when to plant. This is kind of important, and we're sort of seeing that effect now. We've had a very mild winter. It's been very hard, even for me. I'm chomping at the bit to get out in the garden. These beautiful days have made all of us feel like we should be able to just get out and start gardening, but we're getting a little bit of a wake-up call with the hard freeze that's been predicted for the end of this coming week. So with the temperate fruit trees, there still are some bare root fruit trees available in the area, not as many now as we used to have. Those should be planted in the dormant season only. We shouldn't even press the season too much on bare root fruit trees. We need to plant them when they are fully dormant. No leaves, no bud swelling, no flowers. Containerized fruit trees are a different situation. That's given us an awful lot of freedom with both our planting and our selection in the area. The dormant season is still preferred because the temperate fruit trees need a period of time to get re-rooted out into the soil. So the dormant season is preferred, but just not absolutely necessary. Early spring is the next favored time period. And then fall planting is really very, very good for the temperate fruit trees. When it first starts to cool off in October, from that really all the way through Thanksgiving, even into early December, planting fruit trees during that period of time gives them a full 6 months of root growth development before they have to face their first really hot, humid summer. So it's a really good way to get temperate fruit trees off to a very well-established start. With the semi-tropicals and tropicals, we have an opposite situation. They can be planted in the warm parts of the year. Semi-tropicals and tropicals can be planted even during their active growing season. But when it comes to this time of year, we want to sort of slow down and be cautious. and hold them in their containers until after the danger of frost has passed. We generally look for this to be about the first or second week of March. But again, don't follow the calendar so much as you do watch the weather. You can plan to plant in that first week or two of March, but then keep an eye on the long range forecast. Anytime you do something major to a fruit tree for about a 2-week period of time after that, it is less hardy than it is at normal time. So we don't want to push that window too much. We want to give them a little bit of time to get established before they get cold. If it's late fall, I would hold off. Again, they can be held in their containers and will be perfectly happy and healthy. If you're caught in a situation where you still have trees to plant and it's October, November, just hold them over until March and they'll be fine. Preparation from planting, we want to remove the turf from the planting zone. Turf and fruit trees don't get along. Turf prefers a bacterial soil, and fruit trees prefer a fungal dominated soil. So we want to make sure that we don't grow them in the same root zone or same space. It's a good idea to soak the root ball with Super Thrive or another growth stimulator to reduce transplant shock. Normally I do this the morning of planting or even the day ahead so that we are going to get it off to a good start with less trauma. If it's not bare root and it's been grown in a container, it is a great idea to unpot it and really examine the root ball before you plant. If it's in the dormant season, I will actually remove as much of the nursery soil as I can from the tree, basically bare rooting the tree again before I plant it. If it's a tropical, I may what we call semi-bare root, where we're removing the obvious loose soil around it, maybe not all of the soil around the roots of the tree, but enough that I can examine the roots and make sure that I don't have any strangling roots, circling roots, and remove any dead or damaged roots as well. The nursery media is very low quality, and it's not from any devious or I don't know, it's not, they're not trying to do anything or pull anything over on us. It's just that the nursery soils that are available are there to handle the nursery conditions. So the plant needs to be able to have something it can root into quickly. So they're very loose media normally. They need to be able to withstand fertigation systems, which is basically a fertilizer injection system on a regular basis. And it needs to be economical so that they can keep the cost of trees down for the consumer. So it's really just not great quality media. It's not composty and wonderful loamy soil like we want to have our fruit trees in. So I do try to remove as much of that as possible, depending on the time of year that I'm planting. This is what you're looking for and something you'll quite commonly see. This happens when bare root is canned up. So these very heavy roots that you see right here are where the tree was grown in the soil in the original wholesale nursery. Then it was dug up as a bare root tree right here, put into the container, and then all of these new feeder roots grew from these heavier roots that were cut off at when the tree was dug. So these new feeder roots are very vigorous, but they've had nowhere to go. So you can see that they've started circling in the pot right here. We want to avoid that. We don't want to allow them to continue circling. So you can prune roots just like you prune the top of a tree. Make sure that your pruners are clean. I spray mine with just isopropyl alcohol in a dollar store sprayer. We want to make clean cuts, not jagged cuts, just like with human flesh. A clean cut will heal neatly and quickly, where a jagged cut does not. Takes longer to heal and has more chance of infection. Well, the roots are going to behave the same way. Something else I would advise you to look out for, only because I've seen it far too many times, is that sometimes the original, excuse me, nursery label will not have been removed during replanting in the pot. And so it will actually be below the soil level. So you don't see it in the container until you unpot it, but you can see that that plastic tag has slid down and is surrounding the tree. Sadly, those don't stretch. And so as the tree gains diameter or caliper, it can actually strangle the tree. And just doing analysis of why people have lost trees, I've seen several cases where we dug up a young tree that all of a sudden declined, and lo and behold, the nursery tag had slipped below the soil level and had basically just cut all circulation off of the tree. Here's a fairly good diagram. It's not perfect, but this is a fairly good diagram of the way we plant fruit trees now. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of research has been done on this, and we know that this is also the recommendation from professionals and from educational sites as well, that we no longer dig a hole. Used to be the recommendation was twice as wide and twice as deep. Well, you're better off digging it 3 times as wide and less than the total depth of the tree, because if you disturb clay soil under the tree, that clay soil takes a little bit of time, but it'll settle back down again. And when it does, it will pull your tree down with it. So you're better off to not disturb the soil underneath the root ball, but to dig kind of a wide hole is a good idea. So when we plant the tree, we want to, I dig them actually less. Let me go to this next slide. Dig a bowl, not a hole. And I describe this visually as saying, you need to dig this hole like a wok instead of like a stew pot. So we don't want any straight sides. We want the sides to be sloping. It should be no deeper than the depth of the bare root ball or the depth of the container. And so like if you measure the soil depth in your container and it's 8 or 9 inches, I will actually dig the hole maybe 7 inches deep so that the shoulders of the root ball are actually above the native soil line. But I do like for the hole to be twice as wide as the root ball. And when I start sloping the sides, it actually ends up maybe 3 or 4 times as wide as a root ball before you do that. Again, as I mentioned, don't disturb the soil deep down in the hole, but you can sort of create a sieve or a colander in the sides by pushing the tines of a spading fork into the sides of that hole. You're just creating little channels for the new feeder roots to start exploring. When you've got the hole dug, set the tree into the bowl in the center. Make sure that the tree is straight and steady. And then you want to backfill with native soil only to at least half the bowl depth. Not amended, not added with compost. No fertilizers need to go in the hole at this time. And we want to do this so that we're providing stable native soil for at least the bottom half of the root ball. When you complete this, you want to tamp it, but don't pack it hard. Don't try to stomp it down like you see them planting on TV garden shows. So it needs to be firm, but not packed hard. And then at that halfway point, stop and fill the hole with water and then allow it to drain completely. Even if you need to go have lunch while you're allowing this to drain. We want to saturate the root ball of the tree and all of the soil below and to the sides of the tree. Then after that is drained completely, you can backfill with the remaining soil. Now here you have a choice. You can continue backfilling with the native soil, and then after this planting, we'll start our top-down soil improvement program. Or if you really feel that you need to amend your soil, in the top half, this is where you can add some compost. We don't want to add peat moss. We don't need to add fertilizer, but just adding a little bit of compost here, or even rose soil can also be added here. and chopping that in or mixing that in with the soil to fill the second half will be fine. So once you fill the second half and tamp that soil down, you'll water again. And when you first plant a tree, you should fill and drain around the tree several times to make sure that it's thoroughly saturated and off to a good start. Then after that, we're going to apply compost and mulch so that we have a total of about 3 to 4 inches. So an inch or 2 of compost, and then your mulch on top of that. That will start your top-down soil improvement. With mound planting, and this is becoming more and more popular in our area. And I was originally taught mound planting by Jim Moss of Moss Nursery. I came from a completely different part of the country and had no idea how to manage clay soils. And he taught me this method, and it has worked beautifully for lots and lots of plants in my landscape, not just fruit trees. But mound planting is a form of a raised bed, but maybe with not structured sides and not as high or as deep as we would traditionally think of a raised bed. And mound planting works very, very well in the soils that have sketchy drainage, that they're on the border of being okay. Or also for an area that has seasonal drainage issues, where it may have a few drainage issues in the wet season, but be dry the rest of the year. This mound doesn't need to be just right around the root ball. It does need to be about 5 or 6 feet wide. If it's not wide and flat like a mesa, then with a heavy rainfall, it can actually wash the soil away from the roots. So we want it to be nice and wide and low so that it doesn't wash away. So to plant, you'll plant a slight bowl to stabilize the root ball. So we're going to dig a slight hole right here, just a place to set the root ball down. And then once we set the root ball down into that little shallow depression, then the entire rest of that root ball is going to be mounded soil around the plant. And it's going to take probably at least a half a yard of soil to be able to properly plant. Once we're planted, we want to move to early training. And training always starts at planting, regardless of what type of fruit tree you're planting. And I think I've already mentioned that the first 3 years are going to be the most active and important in the training of the tree. And the main thing to remember here when we start early training is that this is where you're going to start thinking about what is the height of the tree that you want to have when it's mature. And this is in your control. It is your choice. It doesn't have to be bound by books or what the catalog says the tree, height and width should be. And it has nothing to do with the opinion of your neighbors or family or friends. This really has to do with what do you want to do to manage your trees. Most trees now, most fruit trees are being planted to grow and trained to grow much lower than traditional fruit trees that we've seen in orchards of the past. And this is true even on a commercial basis. The whole goal here is to get the fruit in reach. If the fruit is in reach, you can see it to inspect it, you can harvest it, you can thin and prune quite well throughout the year. You can spot any problems before they take hold in the tree. And so how tall is tall enough? Well, each of you listening today may have a different height that you would like for this tree to be. If you're planning on using, fruit trees other than the nut trees are not shade trees. So we're not going to grow these thinking that they're going to provide shade for the garden. We want to worry about production, and we want to worry about the health of the tree. So the height that you can reach to thin and harvest by standing flat on the ground, or if you choose a short step stool, is probably the right height for the tree. Just because it can grow 15 or 20 feet tall doesn't mean that we should allow it to grow that 15 or 20 feet tall. So choose a height that works for you, and then keep the tree to that height for its lifetime. Now I'm 5'4", my hands fully extended. I can manage trees that are 7.5 feet tall, which is just fine. You'll find that most trees in commercial orchards are no taller than that. It's not the image that we see on TV where they have, very tall harvesting ladders in the top of an apple tree. In fact, the apples that we can grow in our area are all naturally slightly dwarfing size, and we would never need those tall ladders to harvest an apple tree. Some of you who may be 6.5 feet tall might be perfectly comfortable with an 8.5, 9 foot tall tree. The first question people ask, or the first concern they have when we start talking about training trees to be a little bit shorter is, well, is that going to cut back on my production? Well, in all honesty, the scaffold branches, and the scaffold, think of that as the skeleton or the framework of the tree. For temperate fruit trees, it should start at about knee height. Different for things like the citrus. And the trees will usually average that 6 to 7 feet tall. And that results in a canopy, the fruiting canopy, that has a depth of about 4.5 to 5.5 feet. And most fruit trees will average between 150 to 300 pieces of fruit per tree at that size. I think most of us don't buy 300 apples a year. I might, because I eat apples every day, but most of us don't do that. And 150 to 300 pieces of fruit per tree is enough for both fresh eating at the table and also for preserving and for sharing, if those of you who like to share your fruit, which we do for sure. So the trees, you may have slightly reduced production, but you're going to benefit from all the production of the tree. I often drive around town. I'm sure some of you do too. We see tall fruit trees peeking over people's fences, and they've harvested all the fruit in the lower part of the tree. And then there's kind of a line there above the fence where the fruit is still hanging in the tree because it's not convenient to harvest. So the whole goal of growing fruit is to be able to conveniently harvest and process the fruit. And as I mentioned already, most commercial orchards now are growing their trees where they do not require ladders and heavy equipment. It takes time, it takes extra labor, and there's a liability factor involved. So they keep their trees low and wide. In fact, the last commercial apple tree orchard I was in, there wasn't an apple tree in the orchard that was any higher than my shoulders. Shorter trees are also easier to protect from the standpoint of freeze or hail protection, things like we might have coming this week. So we normally don't protect our temperate fruit trees because they need the cool weather. However, we're now in a situation where a great many of us, our temperate fruit trees are in full bloom. My peaches are in full bloom, my plums are in full bloom. And frost settling in the open flowers can kill those open flowers, and therefore I won't have fruit. So we don't need to wrap the tree. The whole tree doesn't, it's not the ambient temperature is not going to bother the tree itself. We just don't want the frost crystals in the flowers. So what you see on the left side of your screen allows you to throw a frost cloth just over the top of the tree. This would also be good hail protection. And keep that radiant frost from settling into the flowers, and they'll be fine. And you can use clothespins, or in this case, the gentleman is just using twine just to get it attached to the outer twigs of the tree, and the tree will be fine, and we'll get through this frost just fine. Or if you have to, in the case of citrus, tropicals, and more tender trees, you can go ahead and drape the frost cloth completely over the tree all the way to the ground. You couldn't do this with a 20, 25 foot tall tree or more, but it's very easy to do with a tree that is in that 7, even 8 feet tall. One person can do it and with a little bit of effort, and 2 people can easily protect fruit trees if they're kept lower and wider. In addition, the smaller fruit trees provide the ability to do bird protection. Again, this would be impossible to do in a full-size standard fruit tree, but very, very easy to do in a tree that is trained to be a little bit shorter. In this case, this is great bird protection in that they have attached the bird netting to the fence behind this little apple tree. And then as soon as the birds start getting interested in the apples, they can pull the bird protection or the bird netting down over the tree, and then they can still get at it to harvest when they need to. And then when they don't need the bird netting, it can be tied back up to the top rail of the fence. So it works out very well. And you can see here that this is a little backyard apple tree, and it's just absolutely loaded with fruit, even at this height. Inspection's quite easy. You can get up close and see if you're having any insect or disease problems on your fruits. And pruning can be done standing flat-footed, which is really a benefit. You can prune much faster and much more safely by doing it this way. It takes much less time to prune. This is actually me pruning some pear trees, and you can see how tall they are, and you can see where I'm fixing to cut them back. This is in a demonstration orchard of high-density fruit tree planting that's actually in the Tree Search experimental nursery. Thinning is something that a lot of people avoid doing when they have a very tall tree that they have to haul the ladder out for thinning. So they'll skip the thinnings portion of it. And really, we say we thin to win because thinning gives us better size and quality of fruit. It also gives more consistent bearing. There are some fruit trees that have a tendency to do what we call alternate bearing, meaning that they'll have 1 year that they'll set very heavy production of fruit, and then they'll have much lighter, sometimes no fruit the following year. That's because they've expended too much energy in that very heavy productive year. By thinning, we have a tendency to equalize the demand that's put on that tree, and so we get more consistent bearing if we thin. The other advantage to thinning, and this is particularly applies to things that are like the stone fruits that have the pit in the fruit, what we really are looking for is the pit to flesh ratio. If we have hundreds of pounds of peaches on a tree, but they're small peaches, they still have the same size pit in them. And so what we're looking there is there's a poor flesh to pit ratio, where if we thin, we'll have more edible flesh to that same size pit. So it's all about size and quality of the fruit. Another great thing about keeping these trees lower and wider is that it's much easier for the rest of the family to participate. So if you're growing trees for and with your children or grandchildren, they can harvest the fruit, they can help you, they can learn to thin fruit, they can learn to spot insects that are bothering the fruit. They can just in general participate in the whole process. It'll be more fun for them and they'll feel like it's their fruit. So just to reassure you with this photograph, there's plenty of fruit in this little peach tree, all within reach. You can kind of see here that this is the vigorous wood that has grown after the last pruning, and see that none of this is fruitful wood. And this happens with lots of fruit trees where there's excess vigor is expressed in the top of the tree, but it's not productive wood. So by keeping this excess vigor pruned off the tree on a regular basis, we concentrate on producing really good, healthy fruit wood here. And this little fruit tree is not but about 7 feet tall, can be managed completely flat-footed on the ground, and still quite a productive little tree. Rootstock can help. So when you're looking through descriptions of fruit trees or through a catalog, you'll see that it'll mention that it's a dwarfing, a standard is a full-size fruit tree, or semi-dwarf or dwarfing. That has to do with the rootstock that it's grown on. But unfortunately, trees don't always read the catalogs, and sometimes they can really exceed the published height and width of a tree. This actually is a dwarf plum tree that was supposed to be 6 to 8 feet tall at maturity. This is where that 6 to 8 foot range is, and it's now 12 feet tall. It's way outgrown, its anticipated size. Pretty much the tree is in a happy place where it's well watered and well fertilized, and so it's exceeded those expectations. So it's more important to choose rootstocks for the ability to adapt to our soils and climate and for their disease and pest resistance than it is to control the size of the tree. In addition, the rootstock choices can have some effect on how early it bears and how long the tree lives. So rootstock's not the whole picture on maintaining the size of the tree. It's going to be your training. When you are pruning, there are some very basics that we need to do. So we consider training the first 3 years of the tree's life, and then pruning after that is done to maintain our training and also to do any corrective actions that we need as time passes. For instance, things like a weather event or an errant football going through the yard that breaks a limb. So we would consider pruning more to maintain the tree after we've trained it to a good framework. Training temperate fruits is different than training tropicals and semi-tropicals like citrus. So we want to establish that good framework or the skeleton of the tree. We need to stimulate fruit wood on an annual basis. We also want to set the canopy depth, which is the height that we've talked about. So there are 3 training cycles for temperate fruit trees: the dormant, an early summer, and a late summer pruning. And this seems like, oh my gosh, that would just be extra work. But really, these are very quick, light prunings. They're not a heavy, time-consuming pruning. It's sort of like deadheading a rose bush. It just takes a pair of pruners and a few minutes. When we're training semi-tropicals and tropicals, that's a slightly different approach because the pruning is not required to produce fruit wood like it is in our temperate fruits. So here we're training for size and shape only. So they don't require pruning from that standpoint, but we do want to tip prune to encourage them to be full, and we do want to manage their height. Generally, there's only one pruning cycle with our semi-tropicals and tropicals, and that's usually once a year after danger of frost or after the harvest. We'll go out and give them what I consider a haircut more than the structural pruning we give temperate fruit trees. I do want to add just a word of caution on multi-grafted trees. When we first started bringing multi-grafted trees into the area, we had passed on the recommendations, the pruning recommendations from the growers, and the growers advised that you keep all of the varieties in check the first few years so that one didn't outgrow the other. And what causes that is that different fruit trees or different varieties have different vigor, meaning that they have a different growth rate. So 2 plum trees may grow at a completely different rate. And if they are grafted together, you're going to see that in a multi-grafted tree. And so passing on that recommendation, what we found is that sometimes people in our area were losing 1 or more of the varieties. So they might buy a 5-in-1 and lose 2. Well, they still had a 3-in-1 fruit tree, but they didn't have the 5-in-1 that they were hoping to get. So what I found by just experimenting with these trees is that if we don't do that, if we preserve all of the grafted varieties in the first season, meaning we don't prune them at all, we don't tip them back to try to keep them equal, we just allow them to grow the first year on their own. The only thing that you would tip or remove would be something that might have been broken during shipping. Then what happens here is the very, very vigorous varieties, when they just are allowed to grow on their own, they serve as a nurse branch for the less vigorous varieties. So they're pulling water up into the tree, they're pulling fertilizer, the nutrients up into the tree. And so the less vigorous varieties are benefiting from that. So then starting the second year, you would start tipping them back and equalizing the different varieties on the tree but we would allow them to just grow freely and sort of just with abandon in that first year. I want to talk a little bit about fertilizing and basically nutrition that we would provide for these trees, because often this is something that ends up getting neglected. For sure, we want to go organic, and this is true throughout the edible landscape. Organic gardening, for a quick, I guess, just a description of it, there's a lot of debate about what that word organic actually means, but it's the practice of gardening using naturally occurring materials. So we want to provide nutrition to our fruit trees that they would find in nature if they weren't growing in a depleted soil. And we want to stop relying on synthetic fertilizers and the heavy use of pesticides or fungicides. The reasons to go organic is that in general, it's going to reduce your personal exposure to pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, and transgenic crops. Now, don't be too concerned about transgenics when it comes to fruit trees for the home landscape, because there are no varieties of fruit trees available to home growers that are GMO. GMO crops have to be grown under contract with the patent holder. And so it's very expensive to do this. So these are being done in commercial orchards. There's the apples, I think they're called Arctic apples, that are genetically modified to not brown when the flesh is cut and exposed. But you cannot buy a genetically modified fruit tree, so you don't have to worry about that or even asking about that when you're in your local nurseries. In addition, there's long-term benefits to the health of the environment, and then to plants, family, and pets. We have to remember that our pets are in our outdoor environment more than we are, and their pads of their feet are not protected by shoes as our feet are. So if we are using synthetics in the landscape, they absorb those through the pads of their feet, and also when they're laying in the grass. And so they receive a great deal of exposure to anything that we use in the landscape. And kids that get out and play and roll around in the grass, we want to make sure that we're not exposing them to things that we'd prefer them not to have. So there's always the question comes up, and quite often organic gardeners are challenged by the conventional growers to say, well, you can't prove that your food is more nutritious than conventionally grown. And over the years, the decades that this controversy has occurred, there have been some contradictory results in the studies. But we have to remember a couple of things. One is that most studies are funded by conventional agriculture, because the organic arm of it doesn't have the funding that it takes to be able to do the research. So historically, small organic producers and definitely home gardeners, we've had few tools to make our case. And so we simply made our case by saying it was just in our personal approach to gardening, that we preferred to garden that way. And then the USDA organic certification program kind of confused the issue with their definition of organic. So they've allowed a lot of exceptions to what we would consider an organic practice. For example, an organic orchard is allowed by the USDA to use some products that would not necessarily be considered organic if there's not an organic alternative for them to use. So it's sort of stretching the rules a little bit from what I think the average home gardener considers organic. So we can actually thank the wine industry for helping us make our case, because there's a tool that's used in the wine industry called a refractometer that we sort of generically call a Brix meter, and the Brix scale. This is very important to winemakers because Brix measures the carbohydrates and the minerals in the grapes so that winemakers can adjust the sugars that they use to keep a consistent product year to year. And we can actually buy these now. The one that you see in this image here is less than $30. You can buy them. I mean, they have very sophisticated refractometers that are hundreds of dollars, but I use one just like you see in the picture here, and it's mine is optical, not digital. It's very easy to use. It's lightweight. You can carry it out into the garden, and it just takes literally just a few minutes to be able to measure this, because you just squeeze out a little bit of plant juice, and it can be done with any plant in your landscape. Very easy to do with fruit, because fruit's usually much juicier than your vegetables are. And so you squeeze a little bit out onto what basically looks like a slide, and then you close the door, and there's an optical reading that gives you a measurement, and then you can compare that to a chart. And there are bricks charts available all over the internet that will give you a rating for, let's say, an orange, and it'll give you a low, moderate, and high bricks reading, and it will let you know literally what the health of that fruit is. How healthy is that fruit for you to grow? So the two things that it measures, carbohydrates, which we already talked about, are the flavor of food. That's what makes things taste good. And the dissolved minerals, which is the nutrition of the food. So the higher the brick score, the more nutritious it is. In addition, the minerals in high bricks foods are naturally chelated, which means that they're more bioavailable. So it can increase the absorption by as much as 76%. So yes, even though the fruit that you produce may not have a specific vitamin or mineral content as high as a supplement, the fact that you're able to absorb more of it when you eat it makes it much more beneficial to you to eat that fruit. So it really does give us a chance to sort of get a good grade in our own garden. And it's actually a lot of fun to do as well. The other benefit to having high bricks plants is that they're more resistant to pests and diseases. Grazing animals instinctively choose pasture plants that have higher bricks. This has been done very commonly the last few years, especially with the advent of genetically modified pasture grasses and grains. A great many studies have been done in this, and they know that animals have a preference for plants that are more nutritionally dense. And I never knew how they detected this until a recent lecture in which they said that the hairs and whiskers around their nose, when animals are browsing, that gives them the indication. So it's through chemical recognition that they can detect the plants that are more nutritious for them. And it makes sense in the natural world, because the animals, that's their only chance to maintain their own personal health. So how do we get bricks, high bricks, vegetables and fruits out of our garden? We do that through the soil, and we have to cultivate high brick soils. Pretty much everything I've been talking about so far will allow you to do that. You can't do it by just finding a magic amendment to use to pour, in the root zone. The 5 basic steps are going to be to establish favorable soil biology, to remineralize the soil and provide trace elements. Trace elements are the minerals that plants need in tiny amounts. We want to use slow release organic fertilizers and add foliar feeding. So let's talk about how we do that. Soil biology is probably one of the most important foundations of growing healthy fruits. Macroorganisms are things that you can actually see, and they are the chewers. They break down organic matter and also aerate the soil. And so these are things like earthworms and the little sow bugs, earwigs, all the little creatures that you can see when you turn a spade of soil over. Then there are all the microorganisms, which are nematodes, fungi, even bacteria. They break down those nutrients and deliver them to the roots of plants. So it really is a relationship between healthy soil and healthy plants. Compost is the foundation material, because all of this process requires the carbon that's available in the compost. You can supplement this soil biology by inoculating it with mycorrhiza, as we mentioned in the soil preparation portion. But using good compost will inoculate your soil with those mycorrhiza. Calcium and phosphorus are both essential to high brick soil. Good news on the Gulf Coast is that generally our soils have sufficient phosphorus in them already. It's the reason you see the low middle numbers in our locally produced fertilizers. But we do have some issues with calcium, and that's another reason that you see calcium packages in our locally produced fertilizers. Our local producers have really taken our soils, our specific soils, into account. Rock powders are another way that you can deliver minerals to the soil very reliably. These are just ancient rocks that are ground up, Texas green sand or glacial rock dust. It doesn't require huge amounts of these minerals. They'll usually come in a 4 or 8 pound package, which will go a long way throughout your landscape. They're relatively inexpensive, and it doesn't have to be done every year. It can be done every other year. Also, a good thing to do is when you're preparing an area for your fruit trees or for a vegetable bed, you can mineralize at that time and then just use Microlife, one of Microlife's products, or Gardenville's products, or Arborgate's Soil Complete. All of them have a mineral package in them that will provide small amounts of minerals throughout the gardening year. When we talk about trace elements, we're really talking about the micronutrients. All of these are minerals, but it's things that plants need in smaller amounts than they need nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus. The fertilizers that we would want to use with our fruit trees are slow release organics. They're the best. What a slow release organic does for you is provide nutrients the way nature does. Trees uptake nutrients based on temperature and moisture. They don't have the same demand every day throughout the year. If you use slow release organics, you have no risk of burning. We don't have the same issues that we do with synthetic fertilizers. And they also don't migrate through the soils as quickly as the water soluble synthetics do. So we can apply them, and then they're available for our plants on demand when they need them throughout the year. Molasses supports microorganisms. It's kind of funny. We think of molasses as something that we use to sweeten things. And of course we do, but horticultural molasses is the food for microorganisms. So if you really want to keep your soil biology high and keep those colonies very healthy and active, you can use molasses. Dried molasses is available from garden centers. It's basically horticultural molasses that's been sprayed on a substrate. Usually it's ground nut hulls of some kind, and then it's flash dried. So it's available to you in a very easy to apply method. I broadcast it around my whole landscape a couple of times a year. Microlife and Gardenville, well, most of our locally produced fertilizers all include dried molasses in them as well. I've mentioned several times local is best. I will say that we are very blessed to have some really good products made for us locally. They have taken into account our local climate and our soil conditions, what our soils actually need. They're made of locally sourced components as well, which is, really good from the standpoint of sustainability. And they're often local collaborations where local soil scientists have worked with nurseries and industry professionals to provide these products for us. I'm an advocate of foliar feeding. Pretty much everybody that's taken any of my classes can guarantee that at some point during the program, I'm going to talk about foliar feeding. Plants absorb the trace elements and minerals very easy through their leaves. So the bulk nutrients, the N, P, and K, those are more easily absorbed through the roots. So that's, we can't do one or the other. We need to do both in conjunction. Foliar feeding regularly is an important part of a high brix plan. It's a good way to provide minerals or avoid deficiencies and keep that really high brix content in our fruits and vegetables. We know that through foliar feeding, the nutrients are translocated to the roots, and they're translocated to the roots fairly quickly. When they use foliar feeding in a greenhouse, a commercial greenhouse, to test for deficiencies, they actually can measure the mineral that they're applying to the foliage in the roots within about 45 minutes of application. So it's translated through, they have, plants have a vascular system. It's different than ours, but they do translocate nutrients throughout the portion, every portion of the plant. Sea-sourced products are a really good way to deliver these minerals through foliar feeding. So we're talking here about seaweed extract, fish emulsion, and compost teas. I wouldn't use fish emulsion exclusively because it's very high in nitrogen, and that's not our goal. Usually, if I was going to err, it would be on a sea-based product that may have some fish emulsion in it, but was basically a kelp or seaweed product. You can add Epsom salts at about a quarter cup per gallon when you do this. And Epsom salts are not a harmful salt. Usually you mention the word salt to a gardener and we get spooked by it. But it's a chemical salt, not a sodium salt. So it's magnesium sulfate. It does not build up in the soil. It's non-burning. It has a tendency to make plants grow bushier and produces more flowers. And in the case of fruit, flowers equal the fruit. So that's a benefit to us. Studies that were done by the Epsom Salt Council, so we always have to know where'd the money come from. It does increase chlorophyll production and improves the absorption of the macronutrients, the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Regular use of compost can reduce your reliance on fertilizers of all kinds. It's basically nature's nutrient balancer and booster. We want to make sure that we apply this at least once a year. Twice a year is best. In the fruit garden, for sure, that twice a year application is good. In the vegetable garden, it's easier because we can apply it every time we change a crop out. But compost can correct soil composition, is really beneficial to us, and we do not have to till it in to get its benefit. We can apply it on the surface and then allow all of that soil biology to carry it down into the soil for us. And this happens faster than you know. I've never ceased to be amazed at how a surface application, how quickly the soil below that surface application can improve. Compost is the essential partnership between plant and soil. The soil is very supportive of the soil food web. The soil food web includes macro and micro organisms that all work in concert with each other. Regular applications of high quality fungal compost should be part of your nutrition program. And fungal compost is, there are two different types of compost as well. And leaf mold compost is the one that supports the fungal colony the fastest. The soil type you have does make a difference in how nutrients are made available. If you have that perfect, moist, sandy loam, nutrients are more available than they are in clay and silty soils. Clay does have a very high amount of native nutrients. It's mineral rich, but they're less readily available. And that's the reason that we want to be constantly working on building our soil in the fruit garden. In very wet soil conditions and in very dry soil conditions, nutrients become less available because there's less water to provide the lack of or provide root absorption. And we know that in very wet soils, the roots will actually close themselves off to protect themselves from too much water. So that all makes a difference in how well plants are using nutrients. We can kind of see that in plants that are sensitive to that, like peach trees. You may have the soil perfectly fertilized around your peach trees, but if we have that week or 10 days of very heavy rainfall, you'll see the peach tree leaves will wilt and then they'll yellow and they'll fall off. They'll generally replace themselves as soon as that particular time of stress is over. But the reason they've yellowed and fallen off is because their roots have closed themselves off and they're no longer absorbing the nutrients, even though you've provided them. Native soils were estimated to have about 10% minimum organic matter before cultivation. And when you hear a farmer talk about tired or spent soil, that's how they're defining it. They're saying that there's been no seasonal replacement of the organic matter, and so the soil has now been spent or worn out. Soil health is very severely affected by the loss of organic matter. So this is something that you should be tending to really throughout the gardening year. The goals of fertilization are to replace lost nutrients. So we assume that there are nutrients in the soil and that through the growing year, the plant is utilizing those nutrients. So we're not really trying to do anything more than just replacing them so that they're continuously available to the plant. We want to provide a good environment for plant growth so that we have healthy trees. And also fertilization can be tweaked a little bit to promote the characteristic that we're looking for. So fertilizer can be tweaked to favor flowers, fruits, foliage, or color of a plant. Regardless of how you choose to fertilize, we do want to avoid over fertilization. Number one, it's just a waste of money, which we don't want to do. It can cause plant damage if it's done improperly, especially when using synthetics. But over fertilization can upset the soil's nutrient balance. And that's something that it takes longer to correct. So it's better to avoid it in the first place. But everyone in this Houston area lives in a stormwater runoff zone. We live in a watershed. And it doesn't really matter if a nitrogen flush into the bay is from a synthetic nitrogen source or an organic nitrogen source. It's still damaging to the bay ecosystem. And in the case of the Gulf Coast, the estuaries, which are the nurseries of the sea, can be very negatively affected by nitrogen flushes that cause a particular, bloom of, and then quick die off of some of the algae. So we want to make sure that we don't contribute to that. In general, you'll hear many, many gardeners talk about the fact that we're fertilizing the soil, not the plants, and that is true. If the soil is healthy, plants are going to be healthy. So our constant goal is to work to be building healthy soils through everything we've talked about today, through the use of compost, natural fertilizers, rock minerals, and a good coating of mulch. The soil does not like to be bare. When it comes to nutrients, there's really not a magic bullet. So a lot of times gardeners are looking for, well, what's the one thing that I can put on my plants that's going to take care of this? And I've heard all kinds of theories and combinations, coffee grounds and eggshells and this, that, and the other. It doesn't really work that way. We need to provide all of the nutrients essential to plant growth. And there are over 90 minerals that are essential to perfect plant growth. Macronutrients and micronutrients. All of these have to be water soluble to enter the plant's roots. So soil microbes, all that soil biology that we're trying to favor, they're what facilitate that water solubility. So we really cannot avoid, don't want to avoid getting that sufficient amount of carbon that's available. And organic matter is what's going to provide those carbon molecules. This next few slides, I'm not going to spend too much time on them because I've included them in your slide program more that you have something to refer to in the future, because we've discussed all of this fairly thoroughly, but I just wanted you to have an idea of what particular function the primary macronutrients have to all of your growth. These are the secondary macronutrients. So sulfur, calcium, and magnesium are still macronutrients, but they're just not as much as needed as the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And then here, these micronutrients, this is just the start. As I mentioned, all of the rest of that mineral package needs to be available to plants, but only in very, very small quantities. So all of these slides will give you something to refer to in the future when you're trying to tweak your fertility program. pH does have an effect on how well plants uptake the nutrients. So this chart, also provided for your future reference, shows you that between that 6.0, 7.0, 7.5 range that we're looking for, here's the happy range for the bulk of the necessary nutrients that your plants need. If we get too far down into the acidity range, we start seeing that calcium is no longer available to these plants because of the fact that it's bound up by the pH. Same thing can happen when we get too far to the alkaline side. So this chart will help you in the future if you have some deficiencies, understand that how you can tweak them. And iron is a perfect example in Gulf Coast soils. We see iron deficiency occurring in plants that causes that little bit of chlorosis in the leaves. And the first reaction is that they need to rush out and buy iron to add to their plant, either in a granular or in a liquid form. When generally our soils have very sufficient iron in them, it's the fact that as we start reaching the alkaline side, you can see that quickly that iron becomes unavailable to the plant. So even though it's in the soil, and if you got a soil test, it would show you that you had sufficient iron, the fact that you're over there in that alkaline pH is preventing the iron from being absorbed. So the answer is not always to rush out and add an iron product when you see that iron chlorosis. It's to get the pH adjusted so that the plants can absorb the iron that's already available in the soil. So this will give you a reference for that to help you diagnose some of your issues in the future. The essential elements that make up 95 to 90%, 95 to 99% of a plant's weight, you don't have to provide these at all because these are coming from nature. So oxygen, hydrogen, and carbon are all coming from nature, and the carbon, as long as you keep sufficient organic matter in the soil. I do want to mention a little bit about fertility when it comes to containers. You know, if you skip a fertilization in your in-ground trees, the root system can reach out into the surrounding soil to look for the nutrients that it needs. Your container plants don't have that capability. There's no place for those roots to go to look for something in a native soil. In addition, nutrients in containers leach away rapidly. Every time we water, we're washing some of those nutrients out of that container and away from the plant. So constant attention is needed for container plants. I often will walk through a commercial nursery and you can see that some of their container plants have that appearance of being starved for nutrition. That takes constant work on their part to stay on top of that. In addition, container plants also need those micronutrients, organic matter, and microorganisms that are part of that high bricks, healthy soil. And so we have to provide those things to containers on a regular basis. I strongly advise that you fertilize your containers more often than you think you need to. It's really good to get on a program of half as much of what is recommended, but twice as often, so that rather than putting your container plants in a feast or famine cycle, you provide small amounts of those nutrients to them on a very regular basis. And then we also want to provide compost in our container plants. I mulch all of my container plants with compost every year, remove part of the spent soil and replace it with good, healthy soil. And I use a compost based mix in my containers as well. Need to talk about mulching a little bit. This picture, believe it or not, even though I know this is not the goal for most urban landscapes, this is a very healthy way to mulch a fruit tree where they're literally every part of the root zone is covered with an organic mulch. Mulch is part of your long-term soil building program. You know, we often think of mulch as being a tool to help us keep weeds down, to keep the soil cool, and to prevent evaporation of irrigation or rainfall. And mulch does serve all of those purposes. But in addition to that, when it comes to your fruit trees, I mentioned already that your turf prefers a bacterial soil where your fruits really need that fungal colony to be at their perfect peak of health. So we need to keep the grass from around the tree. It's not, the mulch ring around your fruit trees should not just be there to prevent mower and weed eater damage. It should go out at least 6 or 8 feet in diameter. Preferably, it should go all the way to the drip line of the tree. And it should be very high quality so it'll support that fungal colony. So compost or a combination of compost and a top coat from that is beneficial for your fruit trees. So I like to use tree leaves. Fallen tree leaves have a huge amount of minerals available in them, plus they have the carbon as they decompose. So that's a really good way to get in a good soil building program. If you think about that, you're recreating the forest floor. Fallen tree leaves is how trees build their own soil. It's the nursery for new plants, and it's how these trees keep themselves healthy, and it's how they recycle the minerals that the tree has pulled from the deeper soil through the root system and delivered up into the leaves. The excess portion of that that's available when the leaves falls to the surface and feeds the tree. So it's really how the tree takes care of itself. So you're trying to replicate that in nature. The next choice would be native mulch. And what native mulch is rather than just being a dead woody mulch, it's limbs, twigs, and leaves, and the limbs are less than 4 inches in diameter. So it's really the younger living wood from the tree and all of the little twigs and leaves mixed into it as well. So native mulch is the next choice for mulching your fruit trees. It's definitely part of your perpetual soil building program. So I often see when I go to home consultations, I see the picture that's on the right, where it's just a little ring of mulch around the tree intended to keep things from, being hit by the mower and the weed eater. And that's really not the goal of mulching with fruit trees. It's the picture that you see on the left, where we have about an inch and a half of compost applied first, and then a good quality mulch on top, either the fallen tree leaves or the native mulch. That would be a much happier fruit tree. Not all mulches are created equally, so I do strongly recommend that you buy from a trusted supplier. Again, this is a place where Houston is very lucky in that we have some really superior companies available to us. So we have Nature's Way in the North Houston area, Conroe area. We have the Ground Up, which has several different locations around town. We have Farm Dirt located very centrally in town. We just have these really good suppliers. Too often we want to make sure that we avoid the mulches that we buy at big box stores, which are in large part, they are ground up construction waste, which is really not providing much. It's not completely negative, but it's not providing as much to our plants as we would like to. I use organic mulches only. I don't want any dyed mulch products near my edible plants. I've read all the research on them. Yes, I know that these are soy-based dyes, but I can observe with my own eyes that plants where these dyed mulches are used heavily are not healthy. So I definitely don't want it around my fruit trees. I definitely want something that contributes to that high brix capacity soil. Taking everything that we've talked about in the last 25 slides or so and adding them up, this is our top-down soil improvement program. So top-down soil improvement is a no-till gardening practice. We want to plant in unamended native soil so that we get all the benefit of that tree putting out good, healthy, strong foundation and feeder roots. We want to apply our organic amendments on the surface, replicating the forest floor and allowing soil biology to take those amendments into the soil for us. We want to replenish all of this regularly so that there's a constant supply. And that constant supply will be at all times layers of completely broken down organic material, and then partially broken down material, and then new material on top of that. So it's a constant feed program. We want to apply compost at the time of planting to inoculate the soil with all of the colonies of the soil food web. We want to maintain a perpetual layer of organic mulch, basically recreating the forest floor. We'll let nature be our teacher. The soil will improve naturally, and it'll improve at a depth that will surprise you. It really is amazing that you can take an area of your garden, not amend the soil at all, keep it covered with a coating of compost, native mulch, and tree leaves, and within a few year period of time, you're going to be turning over black, crumbly, beautiful, wonderful smelling soil. And I never cease to be amazed at it, and I never cease to be pleased by it. It's just amazing. Let's talk a little bit about watering, because watering practices are critical to the overall health of your fruit trees. We've talked already about the fact that fruit trees do not like wet feet because it deprives the roots of air, but we do need to provide moisture to them to keep them healthy and to allow them to absorb nutrients. So all of your fruit trees should be watered at planting time. And then after that, you want to monitor moisture in combination with the natural moisture, meaning rainfall. So water once a week unless it rains until the tree is established. And so this may be all throughout the first summer and fall, depending on what our summer and fall weather is for that year. After they're established, we really don't need that weekly watering. And I will tell you that I think more people overwater their fruit trees than underwater their fruit trees. I'll be very honest with you that my orchard does not get watered during this winter and spring at all. It doesn't need it at this particular time of year. So months will go by that I do not provide any supplemental water. Then I watch it during the drier parts of the year, which really starts in May and is going to go all the way to October. So from May to October, that's the time that I worry about watering. When I do water, it's occasional deep watering. Nothing's done just on the surface or for a quick watering. I water very deeply, and then I don't water again for several weeks after that. Your fruit trees will be healthy and they'll be happy. We don't want to overwater them. When you do provide water, early morning is best, and mostly this is because the cooler temperatures of the morning reduce evaporation. In addition, it allows plants to fully engorge with water before the heat of the day hits, which it's basically like we do when we hydrate before we go out. It also allows leaves to dry out quickly, which reduces waterborne diseases. It's a mythology that water on the leaves is going to cause them to have little burn spots. That's kind of a mythology. But water droplets on the leaves can harbor certain fungal diseases, so we do want to make sure they dry out. If you can't water in the morning, just based on your schedule, late afternoon is the next best, and really for the same reasons. The fact that the cooler temperature in the afternoon is going to reduce evaporation, and the plants will be able to engorge in water before the heat hits the next day. You'll water much more often from July through September than October through June. It's just a fact of our particular climate. Drip irrigation is really fantastic way to irrigate fruit trees. It allows you to apply water over a long, slow period of time so that it really has time to soak in deeply and gives you that opportunity to encourage a very healthy root system. Um, we do teach this low volume irrigation class through Urban Harvest every year. And I do recommend that you watch out for that class. When watering fruit trees, we want to water all the way out to the drip line. So the mistake is to take the water hose out and put it right at the base of the tree where the trunk is, because after your tree's been growing for a couple of years, that's not where the feeder roots are. They're out towards the drip line, even out past the drip line of the tree. So that's where we want to water. And something else that drip irrigation does for you is it allows you to expand the drip irrigation system as the tree roots expand, so that you can cater to wherever that root zone is as the tree matures. Natural rainwater, of course, is the best for plants because it's free of harmful organisms and free of chemicals that are used in water treatment. And when it first falls from the sky, it has a relatively neutral pH. We can't, of course, always collect rainwater for our trees, but it's a good idea if you do have a rainwater system, even if it just provides a portion of the water that your trees need. Rainwater harvesting is good for edibles in general. All of us have a special water source that really is distilled water, and that's actually coming from the condensate of your air conditioning system. So in new houses now, you are required by code, at least in the city, to have your air conditioning condensate ties into the sewer system. But they don't object to you interrupting it. So as long as you pipe water to a rain barrel, collect the condensate, and then have the overflow from the barrel continue to the sewer water system, there's no objection to that. So, and then those of you who have someplace else that you can collect this air conditioning condensate, that where you're not restricted by that, that's great. So the condensate from your air conditioning is distilled. So it's very clean and very chemical free. And about 300 gallons can be collected during the average Houston air conditioning season. That's quite a lot of very high quality water that you can capture and provide. I want to touch just a little bit on pests, diseases, and weeds, even though we won't cover these in depth. And this is going to go all the way back to the idea of high brick soils and the ability to be able to grow fruits that have a high bricks content. William Albrecht, who's long deceased, but is a soil scientist who was way ahead of his time and was an authority on the relationship between soil health and human health, said insects and diseases are the symptoms of a failing crop, not the cause of it. It's not the overpowering invader we must fear, but the weakened condition of the victim. So a healthy, well-fed plant that has good soil biology to support it, adequate nutrition on a regular basis, sufficient carbon to facilitate this process, and good foliar feeding will be much more resistant to pest and disease issues in the first place. Another thing that foliar feeding does is it thickens the cuticle, which you can kind of think of like the skin of the leaf. And so that thicker leaf is more resistant to pest and disease pressure in the first place. When it comes to pest management, the first thing we have to remember is that not all insects are pests. So while none of us intend to become amateur entomologists, it is a good idea that you know what the insect is on your plant before you automatically react and go grab something to spray. I got a call to a garden that's really quite a distance from me, but I went down and took a look, and he was very upset about the insects that were on his new orchard. And when I got there, as we rode out to his orchard, he said, and I've been squishing everyone that I see. And when we got there and he showed me what the pest was, they were ladybug larvae, which are a helper, not a pest. So it's very, very important that you do not view all insects as pests. Even if you do identify a pest on your fruit trees, not all of them require that you take action. So if the damage is minor to very, minimal damage, I wouldn't automatically turn to chemical, interference before I just allowed nature to sort of take its course. There are a few things, it's like, for instance, the leaf miners. We really panic about them in our citrus, but the majority of leaf miner infestations are just aesthetic, meaning that they're mild enough that there's really not a reason to interfere unless it's just driving you crazy that you have an insect there. They're not really doing that much damage. Now, they can get bad enough that they start to defoliate a tree, and we don't want that to happen. But if you have a minor infestation, it's really not worth just making sure that you have every pest eradicated from your orchard. There are many non-toxic approaches available before you start reaching for something stronger. Insecticidal soap is the first, and I want to caution you that Dawn and other dish detergents are not horticultural insecticidal soaps. They are detergents. They're very strong. They can strip the natural waxy coating and protection off of a plant, making it more susceptible to further infestation. So if you do want to use a horticultural soap, use Safer, which is a brand name, Safer soap, or another horticulturally approved soap before you reach for something out of the kitchen. Neem oil is a very popular natural pesticide. There we need to read labels because there are synthetic products that, even though they may say neem or have the active ingredient from neem, it's actually been produced in a synthetic process. So natural neem oil, of course, is the best. And it is available to us. So you can get the natural neem oils. Spinosad is kind of interesting because even though it's in the organic toolbox, it's very toxic to bees. So we wouldn't want to use spinosad on our fruit trees when they're in bloom because we're counting on the bees to be our partners in pollination. So if the trees are not in bloom, then the spinosad is safe to use because there's really nothing about a non-blooming fruit tree that's attracting a bee. They're only going to be attracted there when that is blooming. One of the very best ways to have a complete pest management system in your landscape is to invite predators. There are a great many predatory insects that are highly beneficial to us. It's becoming a more and more common practice to plant herbs and annuals near the fruit trees in order specifically to attract beneficial insects. This is even being done in major botanical gardens. The New York Botanical Garden has wide, I think they're about 8+ feet wide, bands of herbs and annuals, even some grasses that are planted underneath their fruit trees for the sole purpose of attracting predatory insects that will come clean up the harmful insects. Insectary gardens, again, this is a class that we teach through Urban Harvest, and this class is kind of growing every year. It's an insectary is basically planting herbs and annuals underneath these fruit trees, and some of them lean towards the things that have tiny flowers, because that's what's very attractive to predatory wasps. So things like dill, fennel, mint, rosemary, these have tiny flowers. Even things that are very inexpensive that can be seeded out. This time of year, in particular, the brassica family. So if you have extra broccoli seed or cabbage seed or kale seed, mustard grows very quickly, and allow them to bolt and bloom. First of all, the flowers are very pretty. Mustard flowers are bright orange, very tall and very pretty, and they're very, very favored by the predatory wasps. These wasps are teeny tiny little things. They're about the size of an aphid, so you'll never see them in your garden, but they're very, very skilled predators when it comes to hunting down other insects. And of course, our beneficial insects evolved with Texas native plants. So including native plants in your insectary garden or planted around your fruit trees is very beneficial from that aspect as well. I haven't sprayed an insecticide in my landscape for so long that I actually now don't even remember the last time that I did. I kind of have a saying that says, I don't have to spray because I don't spray. The philosophy behind that is that we're never upsetting the balance in our landscape. So I don't spray defensively. In other words, there's not a schedule where I say, okay, it's this month, so I've got to spray XYZ, or this plant stage, so I've got to spray this certain thing. I wait for a predator cycle to resolve it, if at all possible. If that doesn't show up in time, and basically that's if the army doesn't show up in time to help resolve it, then you can resort to spraying if it's not quickly resolved. I'm not advocating that you lose a crop just in the idea of not reaching for something to spray, just that we kind of take a deep breath before we automatically reach for something to spray. Sometimes you can isolate the treatment. So for instance, if you had to treat something, you had to spray, and you're concerned that beneficial insects will be harmed by that, then you can isolate that plant so that you're not exposing the beneficial insects. The easiest way to do this is when plants are smaller and shorter. So back to the idea of keeping our trees at a good size. And bridle tool is available in all kinds of widths from major fabric suppliers. It's relatively inexpensive, and that can easily be tossed over a plant, or a very lightweight row cover, because we don't want to hold in heat. One of the very best things to do too is to explore why a pest got out of control. It's the idea that stressed out plants send out a signal, and insects are picking up on that signal. And we really are just now learning how that cycle works, but it does. And so if you see a plant that's constantly being bothered by something, it's a good time to try to do a little bit of research, or reach out to a garden mentor and ask them, describe the problem to them and what the pest is, and try to figure out why it got out of control. And I will say that foliar feeding is going to help minimize that. I have found that it really helps with whitefly control. Yes, a whitefly infestation needs to be handled with an organic chemical control first, but then immediately after that treatment, start foliar feeding, and you'll find that that whitefly cycle of constantly returning really does break the cycle. When it comes to disease management, the very best thing you can do for your plants is very similar to what we do for ourselves, and that's to build their immunity. You build their immunity by creating that high brick soil through top down organic soil management. Also, practice cleanliness in sterilizing your tools. Um, a lot of garden books and magazines and YouTubes recommend bleach and water. I don't want to, I'm the clumsiest person on earth. And if I mix up bleach and water and carry it out there, I'm going to either step in it or kick it over. And so I don't do that anymore. Get isopropyl alcohol. 70% is fine. You can also buy 90% at any pretty much any pharmacy or the pharmacy section of your big box stores. And just put it in a little small sprayer that you can throw in your pocket or in a garden tool belt and carry it around with you, and make sure that you spray your tools between plants as you're moving from, pruning to pruning or harvesting to harvesting. The other good thing about that is that bleach is corrosive to your tools. And if you buy good quality tools, we want to keep them for a very long time. And the alcohol is not corrosive. So it's good for the tool and good for the garden. You can also use barriers to avoid disease. We don't recommend using pruning paints anymore. Those are very detrimental to a tree. The tree cannot breathe and then form its natural scar tissue or the callus tissue around the wound and close it off. So we want to stay with an organic wound paint. These allow the plant to breathe. They protect the brand new wound, and then they wash off over a period of time through rainfall and irrigation. And about the time that the plant is having its own natural wound response, they're gone and they're not a barrier to healing. Avoid watering the trunks of trees. A lot of disease issues I see come from where irrigation sprinklers are hitting the trunk of a fruit tree. So we want to avoid that and keep the trunks dry. And then eliminate the carriers. There are certain plants in the landscape, especially things that are in the rose family, that harbor some of the diseases, things like fire blight. And so if your fruit trees are important to you, you may want to think about replacing plants that may carry diseases. And then remove those repeat offenders. If a plant, even a fruit tree, requires constant attention and inputs on your part, that's probably a sign that that particular tree needs to be replaced with a more resistant variety. And there are good resistant varieties out there. And so something that requires constant attention is telling you that it needs to be replaced. When it comes to weeds, I kind of have a love-hate relationship with weeds. I understand the function of weeds in the garden. Nature does not like bare soil. So if you have bare soil, weeds are going to grow. They're considered a nurse plant in nature. But in the fruit garden and in the edible garden in general, they do compete for nutrients. So we want to keep an eye on that. And from the aspect that this is our home garden, weeds can be unsightly, and our homes, need to be a place of pleasure, not a place of stress. But we want to think about the fact that not all weeds are pest species. So, clover was a very popular turf option for many, many years. It's fallen out of favor, but there are dwarf varieties of clovers now, things like the New Zealand clover, that can be grown under and around the fruit trees that are not harmful to the fruit trees. Dandelions, dandelions are kind of misunderstood. They're a very helpful plant. They have a very deep root, and they bring calcium up into the plant. And then as the dandelions decay, that calcium is deposited in the soil. So they actually serve a purpose in nature. And then vetch, that's the purple little flower that grows everywhere and sprawls all over, but that's in the legume family. So it's a nitrogen fixer. So sometimes a weed is telling you something. It's telling you that there's a soil deficiency. And if you don't want the weed, if you'll supplement that soil deficiency then you'll serve the same purpose. Mulches are the very best defense against weeds. If you keep a fairly, consistent layer of mulch, you'll minimize your weed issues by a long shot. When you have, newly planted fruit trees where there has been turf in the past, you're going to have persistent weeds that want to come up, things like the nut grass. So you may need to apply a smothering layer until your forest floor is established. And that smothering layer can be cardboard, newspaper. Newspaper needs to be about 16 sheets thick to be effective. Burlap you can actually find at, they'll give it to you in bags at upholstery shops. It's their trimmings and leftover burlap. And then coir mats, which is they're actually designed for mulching purposes, and that's made of the coconut hulls. So you can put those down, as you see here in this image, right up actually to touching the trunk of the tree is fine, and then mulch on top of that and pull the mulch back from the trunk. Let's talk a little bit about winter protection, because I think it's a little misunderstood. Winter protection is not required for temperate fruits. So your peaches and apples, even things like your blueberries, those don't need winter protection with this freeze that's coming up. Now, the ones that are blooming, the blooms may require protection, but the tree itself, if they're not budded out and blooming already, then you should be in good shape. So I know that right now in my area, the low chill peaches are blooming. The higher chill peaches are just in bud. The low chill plums are blooming. The higher chill plums are still in bud. The pear trees are in bud. They're not blooming yet. So the things that are not blooming don't require protection. It's only the blooms that require protection. Winter protection is occasionally needed for the semi-tropicals. Some of those, the more tender semi-tropicals, may need some protection this week coming up. And winter protection's almost always required for the true tropical plants throughout winter. But we don't want to wrap the trees. That is a misconception, and I see this regularly recommended even on local weather stations about wrapping the trees. That does not provide protection. In fact, I have seen wrapped trees, meaning that the cover is put over the tree and then tied to the trunk. I have seen trees that have been wrapped suffer more damage than totally unprotected trees in the same neighborhood. We always want to tent the trees, like you see in this image, so that the tenting material is tied out from the trunk and there's bare soil around the trunk. And the reason for this is that as the soil releases its heat, that heat will rise and be trapped in that material in the canopy of the tree, which is what you're trying to protect. So never wrap the tree and tie it to the trunk. Tent the tree and make sure that there is open ground that you can see all the way around. And it's always best to water deeply before this, because as that water loses temperature, that heat will rise up into the canopy. So this is another good way to do that. These are actually available from garden supplies like Greenhouse Megastore and a company called Gardener Supply. But you can do this yourself. This is basically 4 bamboo poles. You could use PVC, you could use electric conduit, you could use whatever that you have that you could, tall stakes that you could drive in the ground. And this is frost cloth is wrapped around it, and it's just pinned to the stakes with clothespins, which would suffice if we, just had cold and not heavy winds. And then the top should have a separate cover, so that if we have 2 or 3 nights that you're going to need to keep it cool, but we go back up to 45 or 50 during the day, you can leave the wrapping around the tree, but you can take the cover off the top and allow it to have some sunshine and warmth during the day, and then drop the top back on it at night. But this is fabric, not plastic. It's frost cloth, which comes in weights. It's, I think, 1 pound, 1.5 pound, 2 pound weights. Each one gives about 3 to 4 degrees of protection. So not right up against the plant, and definitely not tied to the trunk. These temporary greenhouses, those of you who love to grow tropicals and you have a lot of them in containers so that they could be moved under cover for winter protection. A tree dolly is helpful if you do that. And a tree dolly is a dolly that has a much wider base or tongue so that it can take the full diameter of your larger 15 and 20-gallon containers. And these type of unheated covers, patio covers, are available at even places like Academy and Outdoor World. They can be easily put up around November in case you need to protect something quickly, and then they can be taken down and stored for the rest of the year. You do need to every year have your winter preparation done by November 1st, which means that frost cloth, clothespins, sandbags to hold the edges of fabric down, your trunk wrap, which can be pipe insulation or carpet scraps if you want it. All of these things you need to sort of have set aside and ready by November 1st in case we get an early frost. If you'll recall, 2 years ago, our first frost came on Halloween, October 31st. And then we may have a stretch of warm weather, or even like a fall spring like we've had this year, and then get caught in that, late February, early March with a freeze. Another good thing for winter preparation is liquid seaweed. Liquid seaweed is really like antifreeze for fruit trees. So you can spray them as a foliar feed before the freeze comes, and then spray in between freeze events. So for instance, if it drops down to 29 one night and then back up to 33 the next day, you can spray after that 29-degree night, and then just kind of keep an eye on things. But it really does act like antifreeze and gives them a few degrees of protection, and sometimes that's enough. So where do you go from here? There's an awful lot to learn about fruit trees. Like I say, I touched on some pruning concepts today, but not pruning techniques. You might want to take Dr. Randall's class in pruning. We have other fruit tree classes coming up. We do have our fruit tree sort of celebration are going on this year to replace the fruit tree sale. So continue the urban harvest classes. That is a really good choice. Experience, honestly, start simple and small is the best advice I can give you. Don't bite off more than you can chew. You can always build your orchard as your own experience grows. A year or two difference, you can learn an awful lot in that year period of time. I always tell people, don't be afraid to fail. Your failures don't mean that you are a terrible person, that you've done something wrong. We always learn from the things that go wrong much more intensely than we do from the things that go right, because it forces us to start thinking and analyzing and studying and trying to avoid it again in the future. And then I would also recommend that you engage on a regular basis. Some of our community gardens around town have open garden days. And even in COVID, people are allowed to visit. They can socially distance. You're outside where we're relatively safe. You can ask questions of the people that are, managing the gardens and growing the fruit there on a regular basis. Network with other fruit enthusiasts. There's the, HUG has regular monthly meetings. Sometimes the subject is vegetables, sometimes the subject is fruit, but a great many fruit growers that you can compare notes with. The Texas Rare Fruit Group has a Facebook group that is very large and can address issues all over the state of Texas, and many people there that are growing exotic fruits as well, if that is where your interest lays. So there are a lot of places where you can continue to build a network of mentors and peers. You can always contact us through Urban Harvest at urbanharvest.org. There is a weekly e-newsletter, which is a great place to go. Articles are posted there, and things that are going on with Urban Harvest, classes, events. Urban Harvest also on Facebook. And then if you really need to, you can always call and ask a question. If you want to ask me a question, they can always forward that to me as well. And then this is my own contact information. My website, I will always tell people I don't sell anything and I don't collect email addresses. So you're not going to get spammed from me 10 days after you ask a question. It's an open source website. Everything that's there, you can, download and print out copies or, whatever seems to interest you. And you can also contact me through the website as well. And so with that, I think that Libby will come back in.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you, Angela. Wow. Like I said, I've been with Urban Harvest for 11 years, and I definitely learned a lot in this class. So thank you for the wealth of knowledge. I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to post the survey link again. Remember, it does really help us fine tune our classes. And I'm also going to include a link to Bob's book. I don't know if someone was able to check the link I sent with the slides, because I don't have y'all's emails right now, so I can't send it. I'll go ahead and post that again and let me know if it's working for you. There's a lot of specific questions that came up. However, there were some that were more general. So there were questions about like when to specifics around pruning. There was one about topping off that struck me.
Okay. All right, Libby, I'm going to let you mention Bob's book for a minute. I need to step and grab a quick drink of water, and then I'll be right back.
Okay, that sounds good. So as Angela already mentioned, Bob's book has a wealth of information about growing fruit trees in Houston, and we'll discuss sort of the surrounding areas as well and the different varieties. And then we do have an entire section on our website devoted to fruit trees, so please check those out. Okay, I'm just reviewing some of the questions here. I believe she covered when to prune and when to fertilize. For those of you that ask questions about mulching with wood chips, my understanding is that you need the mulch to be cured, so they can't be fresh wood chips, or else they take nutrients out of the soil. They do the exact opposite thing that you want it to do. So you can't just put recently cut down chopped up tree limbs essentially around your trees. However, you can let that sit for a while and cure and mix it with compost and whatnot. And once it's a mature compost, you can go ahead and use it around your trees. Lisa George, I'm thinking about your question. We do work with a couple of arborists. I'd like to hear what Angela has to say about that, however.
Okay, what is the question?
Do you have arborists you recommend to help someone with site selection and clearing?
Okay, what part of town?
Shouldn't say.
Okay. Let's see. I think that if we're talking about, I'm going to assume we're talking about for edibles. And so I would say that Urban Organics is a good choice. They do in yard consultations and can actually help with the work.
Urban Organics.
Yeah, Urban Organics, and they have a website. So all you have to do is just search from that. And then Organoscapes is another one. And
Okay.
that's, Ron Breland, and he also has a website. But those are two people that I know are, you know, deeply involved in edible gardens and edible landscaping, and can help with everything from a consultation to actual doing the work themselves.
Okay, Chris, I'm going to go ahead and let you just talk. I think I can do that. Yes, I can allow you to talk. So go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me?
Hi, yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Angela. This was an amazing morning. I really appreciate it. I'm stuck in a position where I feel like I'm getting mixed messages. I've heard that pruning and fertilizing is best done after the last frost and right around Valentine's Day. But my Meyer lemon, for example, still has a bunch of fruit and I'm already seeing buds. And I've also been told don't prune and don't fertilize if you're seeing buds. So which side would you err on?
Okay, so I have sort of a gentle, laid back approach to that. I'm not so much of a calendar watcher. And so I'll say this with citrus, we generally do any major pruning that needs to be done after all danger of frost is past. So it kind of depends on what part of town you're in, but we sort of use the first week of March as the guideline. So after the first week of March, if there's no frosts predicted in the next 10-day to 2-week period of time, then you're safe to prune. Remember that citrus doesn't require pruning for production. So citrus, you think of it like pruning a large shrub. You're pruning a large shrub to get density and a pleasing shape to you. Some people prefer them to grow very full and dense. Other people like to have a little bit of trunk structure showing. So it's really almost 100% a matter of your own personal preference. Citrus trees are going to set hundreds to thousands of blooms, and many of those blooms are going to be aborted by the tree itself. So you're not losing anything by pruning when it's in bud. You're still going to have sufficient blooms to still get a good crop. And there are several citrus that, you know, when it comes along to the time that we're ready to start pruning them lightly in March, they've still got fruit hanging on them. You know, grapefruit for sure. Grapefruit will hang till April and May some years. So there's that balance in between the two. So after the first week of March, you can prune, you know, pretty much all of your citrus that's in bud and not holding fruit. That's holding fruit, you have a choice. You can either harvest the fruit that's ready and then go ahead and give it its pruning, or you can wait until after the rest of the fruit is harvested and prune at that time, because we prune during the active growing season. And so even if it's got buds, don't let that hold you back. The only thing that should hold you back is weather and whether or not your fruit crop is ready to pull. When it comes,
Awesome. And what about fertilization?
right, when it comes to fertilizing, I also, you know, it's kind of odd. When we're using organics, it's a different answer than when we're using synthetics. And so when you just ask a general question, well, when should I fertilize? Then people are constantly worried about fertilizing during, you know, when we don't want to spur growth that could be harmed by either an early freeze in the fall or a late freeze in the spring. But remember that in nature, we don't go out and remove nutrients from the soil during those time periods. The nutrients are there, and the plant is going to uptake those nutrients when the temperature and moisture levels are, give it at the right time, at its signals. So I fertilize 12 months of the year. I don't fertilize heavily at any one point in time. I really pretty much landscape wide practice the half as much, twice as often philosophy. And I fertilize once a month all year long. And I fertilize with only slow release organics. So what I'm doing is replacing the nutrients that those plants have taken out of my soil. I'm not pushing anything heavily with fertilizer. So I think as long as you're using organics and you sort of practice that light touch with them, that it's not harmful at all to start pruning, to start fertilizing this month for sure.
Angela, we have another question about treating leaf curl on citrus.
Mm-hmm. And
I'm going to go ahead, Chris, and put you back on disable your talking. What's the best way to deal with leaf curl?
So we're talking about the curling that's caused by leaf miners?
I believe so. He's talking about citrus trees.
That's the most common cause. So we're going to make that assumption. So the leaf miners, the treatment for those is that you're going to alternate neem and spinosad. So you'll use neem, and then 2 weeks after that, you'll use spinosad, and you'll alternate these on a 2-week basis. But you really only need to do that when the leaf miner is active, which is pretty much going to pick up really as soon as we get past this cold spell. But the leaf miner lays the eggs in the leaves when they're about the size of a mouse ear. So I usually recommend that people treat their whole tree one cycle. And then after that, start treating only those new leaf clusters, which are at the terminal ends of all of the little branches, because that's where the leaf miner is going to be laying her eggs. She's not laying it in the grown leaves. So neem and spinosad, alternate every 2 weeks, treat the whole tree once, and then treat the little clusters of new leaves after that.
And then in terms of another set of general questions around when to plant, when to prune, when to fertilize.
Okay.
Which I think you might have covered though.
Yeah, I think we have
seems like
much if it's about citrus.
Yeah, okay. So then I'm gonna let Garrett go ahead and ask their question. All right, go ahead, Garrett. You're muted. Oh.
Awesome. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I had a few questions just around the planting process and how that relates to planting in native soil versus slightly raised bed or container planting. So for example, I'm building a raised bed in my backyard because drainage hasn't been great. If I wanted to fill that, how high would I need to fill it? And then relating that to using any of the native soil or just all new soil in the raised bed, and specifically for citrus trees.
Okay, so citrus, as I said, has a matted root system. It doesn't have like these individual roots like we do with other trees. So if you're going to build the two methods generally used with citrus are either completely in a raised bed, which would need to be 12 to 18 inches deep, depending on how bad your drainage issues are. Or you can mound plant them, which would mean that you would just dig a very shallow, like a depression, not even a hole in your soil, and then set the tree into that shallow depression, and then mound around that completely with your bed mix. And you can use the bed mix there, because that citrus is not going to go, it's not going to be trapped in a hole that's where we kind of describe it as a pot in the ground. We're not creating that situation. And so it's going to grow the majority of its root system off into the imported soil, and it'll send a few roots, anchor roots, down into your native soil. So just make sure that the bed mix that you're using is like that vegetable garden mix that actually has topsoil in it, that it's not just, don't use anything that's peat based, and you don't want to, that's just all organic material, which a lot of bag media is. You want to use something that has true soil to build a bed around it. So the vegetable garden mix would be perfect for that.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
You bet.
All right, I'm gonna take you off. Okay. Kristen, I think I answered your question about container. Do we need to remove tired soil? Okay, there's some questions quickly about varieties.
Okay.
Someone asked for a recommendation on peach,
Okay.
on a good peach, a tasty peach.
Okay, so I'm going to give a broad but generic answer, because the first thing you need to do is match your peach tree to the chill hours in your part of town. And you need to stay within about 50 to 100 degrees one way, 100 hours one way or the other. So for instance, if your part of town has 370 chill hours, you need to kind of stay within, 50 hours of that one way or the other. So that's number one, is you've got to match to the chill hours. Then after that, I will say that we have quite a few peach varieties in a very wide range of chill hours described on our peach tip sheet on the Urban Harvest website. And those peaches go all the way from 100 hours to 550 hours. So of all of those peaches, the flavor profile is kind of described, and whether or not it's freestone or clingstone. And you can look at the peach trees that we've described that are in your chill hour range and choose from that. And I will say that of the peach trees that are available in our area, in the very low chill, tropic snow is absolutely one of the best. It's a white meated peach that is very, very juicy and very tender flesh, but it's meant for fresh eating and does not preserve well. The Pride series of peaches is a good table peach, but also preserves well. And so there's Mid Pride and May Pride and Eva's Pride and August Pride. There's that whole Pride series of peaches are a superior type of peach. The only peach I would ever say that I've seen offered in this area that I would definitely caution someone against, sadly to say, is Sam Houston. I find that it is a bland peach from a flavor profile, and also of all the peaches, it picks up pretty much every disease issue that comes around. And so even though it's widely available and still on the Texas A&M list, that's a peach I would try to steer somebody away from.
Great, thank you. Okay, we also have a question. Kelly, I'm gonna hold off on yours right now. There's a question about planting in containers.
Okay.
So do you need to remove tired soil? I'm also gonna combine one of Kristen's questions too. If she cannot plant her temperate trees this season, can she keep them in a pot? And then how frequently do you water that?
Okay, those are good questions. All right, so the quick answer on that, can you hold a tree over? Yes, you can. That peach tree is probably going to be in what we call a 3/5. Basically, it's a 5-gallon container, although I'll be honest with you, industry 5-gallon containers do not hold 5 gallons of soil. But I would step it up into a 7-gallon or a 10-gallon. Young peach trees put on a very vigorous root system quickly. So I would have no problem stepping it up into a 10-gallon for sure. But it can definitely be held for a year in that condition. Would I remove a lot of the nursery soil before I planted in a container? And I would say definitely yes. I really have examined this soil. I've worked in the nursery industry. I know what these soils are, and they're really not good quality soils. They're very temporary and they meet the nursery need, but they're not nutritious soils. So I really do practice removing as much of that as I can, as long as I'm not planting in, June, July, where but if I'm planting this time of year, I'll get it all off. I'll even wash the residue off with a water hose. So yes, in answer to your question, then I would examine those roots very thoroughly. I would trim anything that looks broken. I would trim anything that looks like it might be trying to circle, give it a good root pruning before I planted it. And I would plant it in a compost based mix. Something from farm dirt or Nature's Way or the ground up, or I just would compost based soil, no peat based soils from the big box stores, because those are basically a nutritional desert for fruit trees and they don't support soil biology. So I think I got that question answered.
Excellent. I'm going to let Kyle ask his question live because I couldn't find it. All right, Kyle, you're muted. There you go.
All right, thanks so much. I had asked this in Bob's class on the tree pruning, and I guess I didn't quite clearly understand it, but I guess one thing I was concerned about, I know like keeping the height to a certain reachable height, 6-7 feet, but just how do you do that without damaging the tree permanently? I know I've heard people say that you can like top off a tree and destroy it permanently. And I was just curious on like what kind of feedback you had on that.
Okay, so are we talking about a tree that's already actively growing, or are we talking about a newly planted tree?
I guess both. Just
okay. All right. So let me, these are kind of long answers, so I'm going to try to keep it to something more practical.
okay.
When you're planting a young temperate fruit tree, now we're not talking about citrus and tropicals here, but when you're planting a young temperate fruit tree,
Yeah.
I commonly cut mine off at my knee height. And that includes if I go to the nursery and pay $50 for a 6-foot tall tree. I'm going to cut it off at my knee height. And I'm going to do that because I want it to branch low and create a very strong framework so that I can top the tree off at 7 feet and have 5.5 feet of fruiting canopy lower to the ground. That's more practical for my purposes. Citrus is a different situation where it's a shrub. Basically, we say citrus trees, but citrus by its own natural growth habit is a large shrub. Well, you know that you can go out in your landscape and you can pretty much shape a shrub to your heart's desire. I mean, however high and wide you want it to be, you can keep it pruned to that. So, and tropicals, each tropical has a slightly different flavor. So that's hard for me to give a generic answer there. But on the temperate fruit trees, you're not harming them. Now, if you have a tree that has grown for years and it's, exceeded the height that you want it to, and you want to bring it back down to that 6 or 7 foot of height, that can be done, but not done all in 1 year. There, we take the excess height and divide that height by 3 years and bring it down 1/3 each one of those years. I did that with a pear tree in my yard that was about 15 feet tall, and I wanted to get it down to that 8 feet high or so. And so take that 6 or 7 feet and take off 2.5 feet a year. The second year after doing that, then you can start looking at, are there extra branches in there that I want to remove? But just bring it down over a 3-year period of time, and they respond beautifully to that. And it's not destroying the tree. It's going to respond to its initial pruning by putting out lots and lots and lots of limbs, and that gives you lots of pruning choices the following year. And one thing about fruit trees is they by nature
Hey.
are very, very vigorous. And so
What happened to Death?
every time you prune them, they're going to respond by putting on a lot of growth, and that lot of growth.
I can't. I'm almost done.
Hang on.
I'm sorry. I'm not on
That's
mute.
okay. Okay. That growth gives you chances to reshape the tree each one of those 3 years. So it's not going to harm the tree at all. And if you have trees that you're concerned with that right now, and you want to take pictures of them and shoot them to me, I can give you some advice on that, just, in an email.
Okay. Does that sound, that concern, does that sound more like a regular shade tree would have more of that kind of a concern, I guess, on the topping thing? Or is that?
Yes, yes, absolutely. The word topping sends most arborists into apoplexy. It's not a great practice. We hate to see it with trees. It can create a lot of structural issues. It's really hard to get them looking good afterwards. But the fruit trees have a completely different growth habit and personality than things like a major shade tree does. So they can be reshaped pretty much the duration of their lives.
Okay. Thank you so much. I don't know if I can ask one other real quick. I know you were saying like fruit trees are not very invasive with the roots and
Right.
the foundation and all, but what about like below the ground, like gas lines and plumbing, like in a suburban backyard, I guess?
Well, that kind of depends on the tree. And so for instance, I would say that citrus is not going to be any issue at all. Like I say, they have sort of a shallower matted root system. And some of your other fruit trees, they're not going to break in there and start growing into the sewer system like a willow tree or something like that would. But it would sort of depend on, outside of citrus, what fruit tree and how close was it to those lines.
What about an avocado tree, for instance?
Yeah, an avocado I might worry about, because those we don't generally prune for height. An avocado is just allowed to grow to height. And one of the reasons for that is we don't have the same concerns with an avocado tree that you do with a peach. For instance, we keep peaches low because we want to be able to thin the fruit, and because we want to be able to, have quick access to harvesting. With an avocado, it will self-thin. It's never going to carry more fruit than it can ripen. It's going to abort fruit like crazy, especially when they're young. And then when it's older, an avocado is ripe to the avocado tree when it is still rock hard, way before we consider them edible. And it drops them at that time. So we don't have that same issue with thinning and with harvesting that we do with things like peaches and plums.
Okay.
Excuse me, Angela. I unfortunately do have to get off, but I don't want to keep people from asking you questions if you are available.
I am.
Okay. What is the best ways? Can I just allow everyone to talk?
Sure.
Well, first I'll just let someone with a question talk.
One other while I'm still on. I had somebody recommend like using a bank sand to mound a tree because of how cheap it is, but I'm concerned about like the nutrients in a bank sand. Do you have any experience with that, or
Yeah, I would say absolutely not. It's
okay.
Nutritionally void.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, I think I'm making you the host, Angela, and then you'll
Okay.
be able to see people asking questions.
Okay.
Are you able to see that on the side?
I think so. Let
Like
me,
Brian Banash has his hand up right now.
all right, I might not be in the right place. Let me look here, chat.
You might have to get out of full screen view or maybe click participants on the bottom.
Okay. My participants bar's on the top, but I can see, I just don't see the other panelists. Let me, oh, there we go. Okay, I see him and I see Brian now. All right, I've got it.
Okay, excellent. Cool.
Okay.
All right, I'm gonna sign off. Thank you all
Okay,
so much.
bye-bye.
Please take our survey. And I hope to see you at more fruit tree classes. All right, bye.
Okay. All right, Brian, I have clicked on you here. I think I have. Can you unmute, Brian? Okay.
There we go. How's that?
All right, is that you, Brian?
Yes, that's me.
Okay, go ahead, ask your question.
I have a question about citrus trees, and specifically mostly with my Meyer lemon tree. I'm the one that asked the question that with the leaf curl, but also as a result of the leaf curl and the attack of those bugs, a lot of the leaves have fallen off. Now, is that to impair the production of fruit in the future for that tree because it's lost a lot of leaves, or are new leaves going to regrow once I take care of some of the issues?
New leaves should grow as soon as you take care of the issues, but your concern is right. I mean, it was a well-asked question, because if you lose enough leaves, you don't have enough photosynthesis to support production on the tree. And so if I had a tree that defoliated to a large extent, I might not allow it to make much production until it recovered. You know,
Okay.
I might actually, I don't worry about removing blossoms because, like I say, most of them are going to fall off anyway, but I might pinch out any fruit until the tree recovered. But with proper care, that tree should recover and put on a lot of new growth. And, you know, depending on what kind of tree it is, it may, you know, put on a flush of blooms later in the year.
Would it be wise to do a more vigorous pruning as a result of that?
It can help. Okay, so what kind of tree is this again?
The Meyer lemon. I have several different citrus.
Yes.
But,
Okay,
but this one was worst.
Right. They actually respond quite well to pruning, and pruning does stimulate growth. So I think addressing nutrition and compost to establish good soil biology, and then a good, you know, living mulch around the tree, you're going to see pretty quick response as soon as we start getting some warm weather early next month.
Mm-hmm.
Foliar feed on a regular basis after that, but
yeah, I need to correct the watering issue too, because I do have spray heads that have been hitting the trunk and
right,
the limbs, and I probably need to put in a drip system around there.
Yeah, that can take a tree down pretty quick, regardless of what kind of tree it is.
Okay. And well, the prune starts. My wife wanted to know when to prune, and I think you answered that earlier. So right after the freeze is over.
Yeah, I think, you know, just sort of look at the long range forecast. I will say that spacecityweather.com is very reliable on weather predictions. They advertise themselves as a no hype. They're not tied to a network, so they're not looking for ratings. And it's you know, it's a couple of meteorologists, and they really have provided some very dependable weather forecasts for gardeners. So Space City Weather, just follow them and you'll be able to see the longer range forecasts.
Well, terrific. Thank you. And thank you for all your time today. It's much appreciated.
Absolutely.
More of your time. I know there's probably other people that have some questions too. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Okay, Chris, I'm gonna allow you to talk, and if you'll unmute.
Yep, thank you very much. I have
Okay.
an improved Meyer lemon and a grapefruit and an orange tree that were all planted at the same time about 3 years ago. Similar soil, similar drainage, similar sun. The Meyer lemon gave us over 150 fruit last year. We couldn't even get through all of it. This
Right.
year, we've got probably close to 100, still a few left on the tree. But our grapefruit finally produced one this year. We had, I think, 2 oranges last year and nothing this year. The foliage looks good, but I'm just wondering if you have any input on what we might be doing a better job on so that we can get production out of the grapefruit and the orange like we've seen on the lemon.
Okay. How long have they been in the ground?
3 years.
Okay. You're really just kind of coming into their age of production right now, Chris. They and it's the larger fruits take longer than the smaller fruits do. So Meyer lemon will produce fruit very young. In fact, it'll produce fruit the first year after grafting. But some of the oranges and grapefruits can take anywhere from 3 to 7 years to really start production after grafting. So I wouldn't give up on it yet. I would say that those trees are probably just now going to start coming into their production cycle. So I think as long as you provide the basics, it's just a matter of maturity.
Excellent. I have found that in addition to fertilizer and sun and soil and water, a big, healthy dose of patience is really important in the garden. Thank you
Yeah,
again.
it really is. Thank you. But the nice thing about it is they've built a good root system in the meantime. Okay, let's see here. If I see anybody else with a question, if you raise your hand, let me see here. Okay, Angie, I'm going to allow you to talk if you will unmute.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great. So we planted almost identical to the last lady. We have a grapefruit and an orange and a lime tree all in an area, and they've only been planted 9 months, so they really haven't grown, but they still look healthy, except for the fact that the green leaves will get this yellowing along like the veins. And so I figure the tree is trying to talk to me. I must admit, I've done, other than just really putting it in with good soil and compost, we've not done like any type of fertilizing. So maybe that's what it's asking. I was just,
Okay.
I don't want to overdo it and overcompensate now. So I didn't know if that's a common thing for leaves or asking me for help.
Okay, well, both. It is common and it's asking you for help. So generally with citrus, that is caused by the pH of the soil. So it's iron chlorosis, but your answer is not iron. The mineral that offsets iron is magnesium. And so if you'll apply Epsom salts, magnesium sulfate, around that tree, that will unlock the iron that's in our soil and allow the plant to uptake that iron. So your soil has what's in it, you just have to give it the key. So they're young trees, and so I would recommend, like, I know that my closed hand is a fat quarter of a cup. So I would apply about 2 cups of Epsom salts and then spread it around the drip line of that plant. That will help unlock the iron so your tree can take it up. And then I would start foliar feeding with a sea-based product right after this freeze. And then I would foliar feed it every 2 weeks until that chlorosis starts to clear up, and you'll see it actually, the yellow start declining and the tree start to green up. And then I would switch to once a month on a regular basis. Now, the product that I would use is Microlife's Ocean Harvest. That is probably that's the Cadillac of foliar feeds. And right behind that, if that's generally available all across the area. If that's not available for some reason, Soil Mender, which is also a Texas product, Soil Members Foliar Plus is another very good foliar feed. And I think between those 2 things, in a few months, you're going to see a big turnaround in the tree.
Thank you. This class has been very helpful. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm glad to have you. Okay, Mary, let me see here. I'm gonna click allow to talk and I need you to unmute.
Hi there, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. What can I do for you?
Couple of items. I've been trying to grow pomegranates and my Maya lemon is not producing, but I had a great grapefruit season. And then unfortunately I pruned it back, back in November, December, because it was a problem with mowing. So my first question, I guess, is about my pomegranate plant that I think I bought it from Urban Harvest about 5 or 6 years ago.
Okay.
Produced a lot of immature pomegranates over the years, but they just drop off, and they're in a very, they're planted on the very side of a driveway, so there's not a lot of space. And I'm just wondering what to do, because I've just sort of ignored it. It's not doing anything. And then I got a dragon fruit plant from somebody, and I want to know what to do with that. So those are and then my Maya plant, which is not producing anything, which I put in the ground finally.
Okay. And how long has the Meyer been planted, Mary?
It's been planted about a year, but I had it for several years before that in a pot, and it used to flower and smell very fragrant. I maybe grew a couple of lemons, but I finally moved the ground, but it hasn't I think it probably got shocked or something.
Right. Okay. So let's start with that one right quick because it's the fastest answer. It just needs time to establish itself now that it's made a transition. Generally, after we put citrus in the ground, we don't really want it to produce a crop for the next 2 years because we want it to concentrate on producing a good root system to support production afterwards. You can actually set a tree back by allowing it to produce fruit too soon after it's been planted. So since you've got it in, it was in a container and it bloomed, but now that you've put it in the ground, it's been a year and no production, which is okay. Even if it sets blooms and tries to produce fruit this year, I would not let it. I would pinch them off when they're about the size of a marble and give it time to really get established, get a good strong root system, and then look for production. On the pomegranate,
Persimmon.
Oh, huh?
Persimmon.
Oh, I'm sorry. You said pomegranate, so persimmon.
I'm so sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. On the persimmon, now they'll produce. You said it's been in the ground for 5 years.
At least,
yeah. Yeah, it should be producing. And so, does it bloom?
Not anymore. It's in a very narrow piece of grass between a fence and a driveway. So
Yeah, but I don't think that's the problem. Some persimmons need a pollinizer, so it could be that for blooming you weren't getting pollinization, and so the blooms weren't pollinated, and so they were self-aborting after that, because that is a primary cause of that. So it may be that you need to add.
Please try again.
You're listening.
how would I add a pollinizer? I don't know how to do that.
Well, I mean, you'd have to plant another variety as well.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, that we do get into that situation with some fruits where they require a pollinizer, and a pollinizer is just another variety, not another tree of the same variety, but another variety.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Well, why would you want to do that?
Dragon fruit. I was a friend of mine moved, and she gave me a little dragon fruit in a plant, and I am in
Right. Okay, we're having a little over talking in here somewhere. So somebody, whoever's over talking, if you could mute until we get through, then we'll get right to you. But the dragon fruit is extremely frost tender, and so they are generally grown in very large containers. So you have a little dragon fruit now. So I would worry about just stepping it up in containers until you had, a 3 or 4 foot long dragon fruit to start growing. And then after that, putting in its final container. Now they need to be grown on a support and basically treated like a vine. So you'll train the young dragon fruit to go up a support, like a post or of some kind. There's kind of a specific dragon fruit growing support method that's a T post or a wooden post that's created in a T, and then the dragon fruit is trained up the post and then allowed to branch out at the top only, like an umbrella. Yeah, I just popped into my head. Like an umbrella is the best way to describe it. But they are very, very tropical, and so planting them in the ground is not recommended. It's recommended to keep them in a container so that container can be protected during the winter.
Good to know. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Been very informative.
All right. Lindsay, I'm going to click for you to allow to talk, and then if you'll unmute.
Hi, I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit about growing pomegranates here in Houston.
I sure can. Okay, so pomegranates are a true Mediterranean fruit. So they need to be situated in a condition where they have impeccable drainage. So for sure, do a drainage test. And if there's any question at all, plant them in a raised bed. A pomegranate needs to be trained to an open center. And so although they can be trained to a single trunk, it's much better if you select 3 to 5 of the stems coming up from the crown, and prune everything else out. Don't allow shrubby growth to grow at the bottom, and then wait those 5 branches that you're choosing, or spread the 5 branches that you're choosing to sort of create a very open, like a martini glass is the best shape to describe there, so that they get a lot of sunlight into the center. Now, a pomegranate is going to be an exercise in patience. They can take up to 7 years after planting to start producing viable fruit, but they'll practice between now and then. So about anywhere between the 3rd and 5th year, they're going to bloom, and they'll drop all the blooms off, and you'll think you've done something wrong, and you're not. It's nature. Then the following year it'll bloom, and it'll set a few small fruits, and they'll get to where they're about an inch or 2 long, and they'll drop off. So it goes through 2 or 3 of these cycles of producing blooms and small fruits and aborting every one of them until it gets mature enough to actually produce its first fruit. And even then, it's going to be a very small harvest at first, sometimes anywhere from 3 to 5 fruits. And then each year after that, it will get progressively better. So high and dry, open so that it gets lots of sun penetration and airflow throughout the plant, and then patience. And when it starts that cycle of blooming and dropping, you know you're getting very close to production.
Thank you so much.
You bet. Okay, let me see here. Does anyone else have a question?
Yes.
Okay, who am I speaking with?
Oh, this is Brian.
Okay.
Again, we also have some blackberry bushes, vines, whatever you want to call them. And one of them, we got them a year ago, and one of them was the thorny variety, and the other 2 were not. The thorny variety produced fruit right away, and it was pretty tasty. The non-thorny ones really produced nothing, and they look like they've kind of wilted away, and they're in the same area as the thorny one. So we're looking at getting rid of the non-thorny ones and get some more thorny ones. Do I need to prune back the existing one that has produced fruit that did well this past year?
Okay, is it Kiowa?
That's a good question. I don't know.
Okay, it probably most likely it is, because that's the most popular thorny variety in our area. Okay, so blackberries are in the rose family. And so when you think about roses, every year we prune them back hard right about this time of year and expecting them to flush. So blackberries are similar except for the timing. A blackberry cane is going to grow, and it's going to bloom and produce, and then it's going to die back. And so after that cane has produced and you finish the harvest for the year, you should actually cut it off at the base of the plant. It's not going to produce again. And what you're doing when you do that is you're wanting new canes to flush from the ground up. And you're going to be in that annual cycle of the canes will produce, you cut them off at the ground, the new canes that grow that year will be your production for the following year. And
Is
that's
that same for the non-thorny variety as well?
it would depend on if it's a primocane variety.
Okay.
Do you know what those varieties are?
No, I sure don't, Angela.
Yeah. There are what we call primocane varieties, and those will produce 2 crops a year. So they'll send up the new canes, and then in the fall, those new canes will produce a light crop of fruit. And then the following spring, they'll produce a secondary crop of fruit, and then you cut them back. So in all honesty, you're really treating them about the same way. As soon as they finish production, you cut them off at the ground, and then you want new canes to flush for the next year.
Well, since I didn't do that, what is it too late for me to trim them back now?
You mean the thornless ones?
No, the thorny one.
Oh, okay. So no, it's not too late to do that now. Just make sure you're removing the cane that you harvested from, and then new canes that grew, you're leaving to produce this year.
Okay, will do. Thank you.
You bet. Okay, did anyone else have a question?
Yeah, hi, this is Kyle again. I was out for a minute. Did you answer Kathleen's question on the planting annuals and herbs around a tree and just
No, I didn't see Kathleen's question. Go ahead and ask it.
Oh, okay. Well, I guess I've read it slightly wrong too, but I guess what would be your like ideal thing to plant under a fruit tree? I know we kind of talked about annuals and herbs. Is there any that are kind of like your favorites, I guess, that kind of help out the most? Or
Well, okay, so it kind of depends on the time of year. So if you want to establish a permanent insectary under the fruit trees,
yeah,
okay, then I would recommend that you go to my website and look for the insectary handout.
okay.
Because it's a list of about maybe 40 different things that you can plant under there. But I can give you some verbal guidance on that. So you want a mix of things because you want something to be blooming all year that attracts the predatory insects. So small flowered herbs are one of their favorites. So things like dill that'll go through the fall season. Definitely the mustards, radishes, they love little blooms on radishes. So anything that's in both two vegetable families, the brassicas and the cruciferous vegetables, you can plant those and just seed them on a regular basis. You know, the seed is cheap. So I just get the seed, I throw it all in one bag. I just open them all, open radishes and mustards and whatever I can get, throw them in one bag, and then just seed them about every 2 weeks. They'll bolt and go to bloom and then be done. Your native plants like cone flowers, they're gonna love that for sure. Small flowered herbs. So rosemary has small flowers. The lavender little spikes, those are individual flowers. Oreganos have a very, especially it's not the culinary oreganos, it's the oreganos that we grow for an ornamental basis. They have those little small flowers that they really truly love. Salvias are another one. We think about salvias attracting hummingbirds, and hummingbirds do eat a few insects, but they'll eat the beneficials as well as the pest species. But the salvias also attract the predatory wasps. So any of those will do. So small flowered herbs do very, very well for permanent planting. And then lots
Okay.
of natives, cone flowers and Indian blanket, things like that. They really like those flowers.
I guess we're working on planting kind of an orchard down at the A-Leaf Community Garden, and one of the things that as well just kind of in between there's say you do like 7-8 feet apart with the trees and all, just in between there's still grass and all there. I mean, do you think you need to kind of get rid of the grass to be able to plant some of this stuff, or add a little bit of
Yes.
soil on top? Or
Yeah, no, I would get, my own personal orchard areas have
yeah,
no turf at all. They are under a blanket of leaves and have been for years.
okay,
And, I haul home leaves that I pick up in bags on the side of the road and keep under there for years and years and years. The soil is lovely underneath. There's all kinds of creatures everywhere. My husband's constantly talking about how big the earthworms are, that he tripped over himself because he thought he saw a snake. It's literally that idea of the forest floor. And if you can just sort of get that vision in your head and then recreate it under your trees, they'll
yeah,
be better off for it. And
what,
I will say that I also blog for the Arbor Gate, and if you'll go to the Arbor Gate's website, the blog section, there are several videos on my insectary gardens up there, and there's a handout for the class that I teach of insectary gardens that you can download that has that plant list on it. So just arborgate.com, go to the blog section, look for my name and click on my name, and then you can find there's a search window, so you can just say, insectary, and it'll pop both the video and the handout up for you.
okay, great, thank you. And with the leaves, so it does. You haven't found like any like disease problems when you don't cut them up. I heard some people online saying you really need to cut up your leaves before you put them down as a mulch, but
Okay, so that is a very good question. So let's talk about that a little bit. The tree leaves, the fallen tree leaves that we pick up are a mix of all different leaves from all across Houston. And so you're not transferring a disease from a live oak to a fruit tree. Okay. So they're bothered by a different set of things. And so it's not a matter of chopping up your leaves prevents diseases. Chopping up your leaves speeds their decomposition. And so how that applies is that some of like live oak leaves, for sure, they take a long time to break down because they have a waxy coating on them. And that waxy coating has to be broken down by soil microbes before the leaf will start to decay. And so people worry about that, and they worry about, that there's some kind of harmful chemical or component in the leaf, and that's not the case. But a lot of people chop their leaves up because they don't want to wait for that waxy coating. It just takes forever. But it's not a disease issue. It's just a matter of the speed of decomposition.
okay, so fungal growth like below the leaf, that was something that I heard somebody bring up before. That's not too much of a concern with like full-size leaves, I guess, or?
No, that's actually a good thing, not a bad thing.
Okay.
If you I can pick my leaves up and I'll see the little, what they call the hypha, the fungal hyphae. It's in there. You'll see the little white threads of fungus everywhere. That's good. That's what you're looking for. That's a positive, not a negative.
Okay. So do not need to chop up leaves then.
I don't bother to chop them up because I just don't have time. I used to run things through I had a chipper shredder, and I would run things through that, and I finally just gave it away. I'd rather just put them out. Now, I will say this, that some of the leaves, because of that waxy coating, can be a little slippery. And I did learn to know where I'm putting my feet when I step into a bed so that I don't end up doing a very unwanted splits at 68 years of age. That's not fun. But from the standpoint of I just put them down fresh out of the bag and let nature do its thing. Now, while we're on that subject, I don't pick up lawn clippings. If I knew the person who was cutting the lawn and knew that they were not putting chemicals that I don't personally want in my landscape down, I might, like for instance, if I bagged my own lawn clippings, I might feel free to use them. But I don't pick up lawn clippings because people are much more likely to have used chemicals on their lawn than they are in their trees. And the trees aren't affected by them. So yay on the leaves and no on the grass clippings. Okay, does anyone else have a question? Okay, then I will say thank you very much for coming to class today. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Some very, very good questions were asked. And please check out Urban Harvest website for our next classes. And please enjoy the Fruit Tree Festival that's happening on a virtual basis during this next week. And have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good. 11:06.